Tractate Bava Metzia broadly discusses the laws of finding and returning lost items, along with additional points in renting, borrowing, and responsibility. Chapter 1 will begin on the laws of the acquisition of lost objects. The first Mishnah says, if two people come to court with a garment, both claiming that they found it and that it's entirely theirs, they should both take an oath that half of it is the other's and then split it. If one man claimed he owned all of it and the other said he owned half of it, the first should take an oath that 3/4 of it belongs to himself, and the other takes an oath that a quarter belongs to himself, and they split it like that. Similarly, if two men were riding an animal, or one was riding it and the other was leading it, and they both claim it's entirely their own, they should again take an oath that half of it belongs to the other, and then split it. If either admits to the validity of the other's claim, or if either have witnesses, then oaths aren't necessary, they can just split it immediately. The Gemara clarifies, it says specifically both that they're claiming they found it and that it's entirely their own as one claim, which would mean generally that just finding something, seeing a lost item, is insufficient to claim ownership over it. Others do actually disagree with this point, but based on the double clarification of wording in our place, they hold sight is insufficient to claim a lost item. Others actually have a different interpretation of this. They say it's referring to two separate points, where the man saying that he found it references a case where they're arguing over a found item, and saying the second point where he says is entirely his is where they're arguing that they each purchased it. It specifies both, showing both would require an oath as mentioned despite their unique principles. Additionally, the case where they're arguing over who purchased the item must be where they can't just ask the seller, as they both gave the guy money, but he only allowed the sale to one of them, and he's not sure which. So they need to take an oath to split it as mentioned. Now there is a different opinion who says we don't administer an oath in court if one of the parties is definitely lying. This would not apply here, as not necessarily are both lying. They could have just both picked up the item simultaneously, so they actually do each own half of it. It's additionally unlike another opinion that holds if there's uncertain ownership of property, it's split without an oath. Although some suggest this opinion could apply, it's just uniquely not held here as it's a certain claim against another certain claim, where his opinion would not apply. It's debated. Alternatively, we do follow this opinion. It's just that this notion of an oath, in this case of two men seizing a garment, was instituted rabbinically to prevent people from just grabbing other people's items and claiming it's theirs. Still further, there is an additional opinion who holds if there's an uncertain claim of ownership between items, the remainder goes to neither of them. It's just locked away until Mashiach comes, essentially. This would not apply by our case, as it's unique in that there's a genuine possibility that both of them are telling the truth. It belongs equally to both of them, as they would have both grabbed it simultaneously. If it discusses these opinions related, it said, if a man claims another has 100 of his dinarim, that man claims he has nothing, and witnesses claim the second man has only 50 dinarim, he gives the first man 50 dinarim, and takes an oath that he doesn't have the remainder, as the witnesses have the strongest claim of evidence. Similarly, by our case, if two people both are holding a garment, and both claim that they found it, their holding onto the garment is similar to a witness as a proof of evidence, and therefore they split it with an oath. It's necessary to take an oath if admitting to part of a claim as opposed to entirely denying a claim, as entirely denying something requires a degree of insolence that most people don't have, but to partially admit something, that's something people would do, so an oath is necessary here. Now, that's by somebody's own testimony. If there were witnesses, then based on this, he for sure would need to take an oath. However, this is operating off of the presumption that admitting to part of a claim does not make a person liable to pay money. This is debated on from a number of other sources regarding the uniqueness of admitting something yourself in various cases. So, it debates what the logical deduction above is. It sets a number of possible options which are rejected. It brings various cases to try and prove a point that if somebody in such a monetary dispute hands someone a portion of the money saying, here you are, it questioned whether he's effectively giving that portion and whether or not a further oath would be necessary. This is debated. Regarding the earlier mentioned case, if one man claims the second owes him 100 coins, the second claims he owes nothing, and the witnesses say he owes him 50 coins, we said he pays 50 and must take an oath. Now, others actually debate the point that he needs to take an oath, saying a verse implies an oath isn't necessary based on witnesses' testimony. It debates the interpretation of this verse. There was a case where men left their animals to be watched by a certain guy, and once there were no witnesses to this exchange, so the guardian said he never received the animals. Then other witnesses testified that the guardian had actually eaten the animals, so it was said depending what you hold like by the above case, it would determine whether or not the animal owners would need to take an oath. Additionally, in the case of the Mishnah, where both men seize a garment and take oaths to split it, it clarifies that they need to take oaths both that they have a claim to it, and that they don't own the other half, while additionally maintaining their initial claim that they technically own the whole thing, but they're just taking an oath to split it, essentially. The oath is necessary in the first place, as mentioned, to discourage people from just grabbing people's garments and having a valid claim to half of it, as now people would also need to take an oath, which they wouldn't necessarily be willing to violate, and it cites proofs from other discussions. It proves at length that just because somebody is suspect of financial dishonesty, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be dishonest and take a false oath. It asks, if two men were holding onto a garment and then in front of the court, one of them successfully pulls it away from the other, and the other man initially says nothing and only later protests, what the status is. Perhaps his initial silence is him conceding the garment, or perhaps he was only silent as he thought that the court knows he pulled it away from me, so there's no reason to yell. It tries to find a resolution and also debates what the status of an item that's being argued over. If one of the men just decides to consecrate it to the temple, whether or not this is considered to be valid. It debates this from various other discussions. Broadly, it is ruled if people are fighting over a property, if one of them can't fully claim the property by legal process, at that point he's not allowed to consecrate it either. If somebody did legally claim a property, specifically a property which he doesn't need to physically acquire, he would be allowed to consecrate it. It said if two people are holding a garment and they decide to just keep the parts that their hands are holding onto and divide the remainder in the middle, this should be done with an oath. This is different from our Mishnah, as this case is where they're grasping the fringes of the garment. Related, we can infer that when acquiring cloth, you're required to take hold of an amount, and the minimum apparently to take hold of is a 3-finger breadth by 3-finger breadth square. Giving only part of a cloth to acquire it fully is valid, unlike by a divorce document as mentioned back in Tractate Gittin, where giving the divorce document attached to a sturdy string still held by the husband is invalid, as it's not considered to be fully given over. Additionally, if they're dividing the middle of the garment as mentioned, and there's gold thread more on one person's side, that's still divided equally also, as it could technically also be divided widthwise. If a borrower and a lender are both holding a note of indebtedness, a promissory note, and the lender said it's his, meaning the debt hasn't been paid yet and he just dropped it, and the borrower said that he'd already paid the debt and was just given the note as a receipt, so it's his. Some say it should be checked by the signers on the document, others say to just divide the written debt between them. Similarly, if such a note of indebtedness was found by two judges and they're not sure who it belongs to, some say just do nothing with it, others say just do what the document says. It's a debate if the above argument applies if the document was actually certified by the witnesses. It additionally qualifies the points in the promissory note falling between two judges and the different opinions. The debate where the borrower and lender are both holding on to the note of indebtedness, that's specifically where they're both holding on to the standard part of the text in the document, or both are holding the essential text. If one is holding the essential text, some say he receives the contents of that part of the text, others say it's equally divided, specifically if the essential part of the text is in the center, but nearer to one of them. According to the first opinion, that they split the content of the document where it was grabbed. This is explained as there's a difference in a document depending which parts it contains. For instance, if one person has the essential part of the document, he'd also have the date, and that allows the claiming of a property that was collateral. In fact, related, some say this concept is a general principle, that it's the value of an item that's divided. So for instance, in the whole premise discussion, they're not actually splitting a garment in half, they're splitting the value of the garment. Others nevertheless disagree, saying we're literally splitting the garment, as it could technically still be used once split, for children's clothes, for instance, and if it had gold thread, it could be used for wealthy children's clothes. Although by the case of dividing an animal, that would refer to splitting the monetary value, as if it was non-kosher, cut up meat between them would be essentially useless. So by extension, in the other cases, it does refer to generally splitting the monetary value, not the actual item. Based on the Mishnah, some say it implies that a person can lift a lost object on behalf of somebody else, so as to claim it for them. Related, if two mentally incompetent people simultaneously pick up an item, they both acquire it, as they're also acquiring it for each other, and this is instituted to be permissible so that way they don't argue. However, if a mentally incompetent man and a mentally competent man lift an item simultaneously, they can't acquire it for each other, as such an institution would not apply. It argues over what the sources for these points are. On the topic of the mentioned point in the Mishnah of claiming a lost animal by either sitting on it or by leading it, it asks, if there's an animal and one person sits on it and one person leads it, which form of acquisition takes precedence? It tries to prove this from additional cases. It said that sitting in a wagon of an animal is not sufficient to create an acquisition, and it debates if sitting in a wagon is legally comparable to sitting on an actual animal. It tries to prove this from various other discussions. It debates from various further additional sources as to whether there's validity of acquisition through riding an animal and whether that overrides acquisition through leading it by the reins. It mentions by purchasing an animal. If it was specified that acquisition should be done through the normal manner, it would be valid to acquire it through writing in a public domain, and if he's an important individual, a woman or a detestable individual, they could all acquire it by riding it anywhere, as they either ride their animals everywhere in general, or they don't typically leave their animals by the reins. Additionally, it debates if it's valid to pull an animal to acquire vessels that are on top of it if it was specified to do this by the seller. It said it's only valid if the animal is bound, as then it has a legal status similar to a courtyard, which can acquire items through it. If fish jump into a boat on a river, the boat can form acquisitions as it's not considered to be mobile, as it's the water that moves it. Similarly, if a man throws a divorce document into a woman's basket, the basket is not considered to be mobile and can acquire the document as it's the woman that moves. New Mishnah. If a man is riding along with somebody and sees a lost item, if he asks the other to give him the lost item, this other man can just lift it and claim it for himself, even though he didn't see it first. If the riding man is handed the item, the other man no longer has any claim to it. The Gemara says there's a debate by laws of field charity. If sheaves of wheat are left for the poor, and one wealthy man takes some and says it's designated for a specific poor person, it's a debate if it's given to that poor man or not, and it's just given to the next poor man that comes. The logic that this would be allowed is that theoretically the wealthy man can renounce all of his property and become poor himself, thereby claiming the sheaves, and then theoretically, as he can claim it for himself, he should by extension be able to claim it for somebody else. Others say no, as that's stacking two logical leaps. If a poor man reserves the sheaves for another poor man, that would be agreed to be valid. Others disagree, as then our Mishnah wouldn't fit in accordance with either opinion, as people have a similar status to poor people by lost objects in regards to claiming an item for somebody else. However, it can be resolved if the case is that the other man lifting the item initially is claiming that he intended to acquire it for himself initially. This point is further qualified. There is an opinion which says if somebody lifts a found item on behalf of somebody else, that other person does not actually acquire the item. This is discussed along with explanations, and it mentions that by the Mishnah's case, with the horseman and the walking individual, there would be variation. If the horseman said to give the item to him, he only acquires it when he receives it, but if he said acquire it for me, he acquires it once the other man lifts it up. New Mishnah. If somebody sees a lost object and falls on it, but doesn't use a formal means of acquisition, and then another person takes it but uses a proper formal means of acquisition, the second man gets the item. The Gemara says there is an opinion who holds it was established to prevent arguments that the 4 cubits around a person affects acquisition, acquiring any lost items within that area. Others suggest some discussions which apparently disagree with this. There's a point which discusses the poor acquiring left out sheaves of grain, and it mentions it's not valid for them to just fall on them, which is seemingly contradictory. However, it's explained that since he fell on it, it's that he was choosing to not use the 4-cubit method of acquisition and was trying to use an illegitimate form of acquisition which was invalid. Alternatively, it's that this method of acquisition just does not work on private property, and it still wouldn't work by paya charity. Additionally, our Mishnah above seemingly disagrees with this opinion. It says if somebody falls an item, that's not valid in spite of it apparently being within his 4 cubits. So again, it's answer that he's choosing to not use this valid form of acquisition by using an invalid method. And there's also an answer that perhaps this 4-cubit method of acquisition is only valid in alleyways and the sides of public domains where there are not crowds, and it wouldn't work in a public domain. Related, there's a debate as to whether a minor girl was allowed to acquire items through a courtyard or through the 4 cubits around her. The debate is if having an item to be in your courtyard is the equivalent of having it to be in your hand, which a minor can acquire through, or is considered to be an agent, which a minor cannot appoint. However, we bring a source which seems to prove that a courtyard does not act as an agent, and additionally, if it does, then you'd have a possibility of an agent being able to commit a transgression for somebody, which we said just does not exist. There are 2 answers. The first, that a person is only not liable for his agent's transgression if the agent himself can become liable, while an actual courtyard can't become liable, so the courtyard owner would just take liability. Another answer is that a courtyard has no consent in whether or not it does a transgression, as it's inanimate. There's a practical difference between these if there's a liability for a Kohen asking a non-Kohen to be an agent to betroth a divorcee to him. As according to the first opinion, since the non-Kohen has no liability for doing this, so he's not subject to liability, and the Kohen would be liable instead, unlike by the second opinion. It gives additional examples. It's actually agreed that a woman can acquire her divorce document through a courtyard. The debate is whether somebody could acquire lost objects through it, as to whether that's learned from the laws of acquiring a divorce document or not. Or it's that they just disagree if a minor boy can acquire through his courtyard, and whether that's learned from a minor girl who it's agreed can. Alternatively, it's just 2 statements of separate opinions, that a minor girl can accept a divorce document through a courtyard, and a different one, that a minor boy or a girl cannot acquire items through their courtyard. New Mishnah. If somebody sees people chasing after an ownerless found animal in his field, if the animal is crippled or otherwise limited in movement, you can just say verbally, my field acquires the animal. and it then belongs to him. If the animal is not crippled and could move normally, he cannot just acquire it through his property. The Gemara says particularly if it's an unsecured property, the man must be standing next to his field to acquire things within it. It debates sources for this. These points are further discussed in regards to particularities of the necessity of being by property as it acquires an item. Specifically, it said, for instance, by a woman obtaining an item through her courtyard, there's a difference between a divorce document and a gift, that by a divorce document, the woman must actually be there by the courtyard to acquire it. As a divorce document is considered to be negative for her, so it can only be acquired in her presence, while a gift is a positive thing, so it can be acquired by her even if she's not there. In regards to the premise point from the Mishnah that a person can verbally acquire a wounded animal that's running through his property, it said this applies as long as he himself would theoretically be able to run and catch it. If the animal was a gift, this wouldn't be necessary, he could just verbally acquire it. It's asked, if somebody throws an item through a house, so it passes through the airspace and then exits on the other end without hitting the floor, has the house acquired the object? We try to prove it from our Mishnah, but as this case is where it never touches the floor, it's said to be different and it's left unresolved. New Mishnah. If somebody's minor child or a Canaanite slave or wife found a lost item, it belongs to him. If it was found by his adult child, his Hebrew slave, or divorced wife, even if he hasn't yet given her the marriage contract, it belongs to them. The Gemara says the minor isn't acquiring the item as he takes it and gives it to his father. It debates from related discussions on workers collecting sheaves of grain, whether a minor can or can't acquire items for himself. Regarding the sheaves, there are opinions. Some say it's a special institution that minors can collect and acquire sheaves, even though they normally cannot. This would apply also to the poor when they gather the leftover grain. Or it's explained possibly that regarding the sheaves, it doesn't literally refer to a minor acquiring sheaves. It refers to an adult who's reliant on his father, although others disagree with this. It's also debated why a Hebrew slave doesn't acquire an item for his owner, as he is obligated to work for him, and that should include giving him any lost objects he finds. Some say this refers to a slave whose job is something very profitable, to carve holes and pearls, for instance, so he only has a sole job, so things he does on his own time, like finding lost objects, for instance, belong to himself. Alternatively, some suggest a slave found the item as he was doing his work, so there's no lost labor towards his employer. Others say it's that a worker only acquires lost items towards his employer if he was specifically given that task, for instance, to gather fish from ashore. It mentioned a maidservant can keep her lost items, and it debates how this is possible, as a Hebrew maidservant goes free at adulthood, typically. It suggests that she still has a father, and the item is acquired to him. If a man's divorced wife finds an item, she keeps it. And it said, in an uncertain divorce, the husband needs to continue to sustain their wife. However, by uncertain divorce, the woman would still keep a lost item, as we want to encourage them to finalize the divorce. New Mishnah. If somebody finds a lost promissory note, a document of indebtedness, if it includes property as collateral, he shouldn't return it, as otherwise the court would possibly need to confiscate the land, which could have been sold in the meanwhile. If it did not specify land as a collateral, it's a debate. Some say to return it, some say not, as either way the court will collect collateral from the individual's sold land. The Gemara clarifies the case further. It's where the borrower in the note admitted to his debts and the borrower ended up actually borrowing the money much later than specified in the document. So there's a concern the court will confiscate property sold after the date in the document, but before the man actually borrowed anything. This concern uniquely applies here as the document got lost. It debates its content from various other cases. It said regarding the debate from the Mishnah, if a debt document should be returned if it doesn't specify land as a collateral, if the borrower admits to his debt is agreed, the document is returned. The debate only exists if the borrower does not admit to the debt, as there's a debate by such documents if the debt could be paid with collateral land. Others disagree and say the inverse, that the debate is only if the borrower admits to his debt, and if he does not, they definitely don't return the document. It cites sources which debate these opinions. It's explained the opinion which holds that debt can be collected from collateral property, even if unspecified in the debt document. It's as the lack of the specification was an error. This point is qualified further. Related, if somebody buys a field from a man and then it's revealed that the seller didn't actually own the field, it's agreed he's compensated for whatever he spent, but it's a debate if he receives compensation for any work he did in the field in the meanwhile. According to the opinion that he does not, some would say this even applies if the seller specified beforehand he would be reimbursed for his work on the field, as this resembles interest, which is not allowed. It debates it from other discussions. It's additionally argued between these opinions as to whether the purchaser would be financially reimbursed for effort and labor he put into the stolen land. Therefore, the point on this. Additionally, if a man purchases a field and actually knows that it was stolen, it's agreed he does not have the rights to any work or enhancements he's done to it, but it's debated if he even collects reimbursement for the illegal purchase in the first place. The debate essentially is that it's agreed that he's not given the money to purchase the field. It's that it's just an underhanded manner of giving a deposit, essentially, which would be returned, or it's an underhanded method of giving a gift, which would not be returned. The same exact debate exists by somebody betrothing their sister, which is obviously not allowed. It's just that some say it's a unique manner of giving a deposit, some say he's trying to give a gift. It says both must be specified to show the opinions apply by both relatives and non-relatives. By the field, the reason this deposit or gift allow him to use the stolen field in question is that he's just working the land, and when the original owner claims it back, he's reverting the money to either be a deposit or a gift. By the initial case, where the man unknowingly purchased a stolen field, the law has ruled that he has the right to what he spent, and he's reimbursed for the enhancements he made to the field. And if he knew the field was stolen when he purchased it, he only gets repaid for what he spent on the land. And if the collateral is not specified in the document, this is considered to be a scribal error by both promissory notes and deeds of sale. And in the event that a man steals a field, and then sells it and then buys it from the original actual owner, it's that he can't retake the field from the man he sold it to, as he had sold him the rights to the field. The reason the thief is properly purchasing the field in this case is debated. Some say it's so that way he won't be called a robber anymore, others say it's so that way he'll be considered to be honest. There's a practical difference if he gave the field to the second man as a gift, as here it'd be dishonest to reclaim it, but it wouldn't make him a thief to take it back. In the event that a thief steals land, sells it to somebody, and then sells it or gives it to a second man, if the thief then purchases the land properly from the original owner, it wouldn't go to the first man he sold it to, as he's clearly not establishing him as the owner. This would similarly apply if the thief had inherited the land after stealing and selling it, and the man he sold it to does not acquire the property. If the thief, after stealing and selling the land, was given the land by the original owner to repay a debt, if he was given options of land to choose from and picked this, it's clear he wants to establish it validly to be acquired by the man he sold it to. Otherwise, no. If the thief was then given the land as a gift, it's a debate as to if it has the same status as inheritance or a sale. Regarding the fact that this thief is apparently purchasing the land he stole and sold to protect his reputation, as mentioned, this desire would last until he's brought to trial for his fraud. Others say it's once the court rules and gives authorization to the purchaser to claim the thief's property. Others say it's until the thief's property is assessed to see how much he must repay. It is debated further as to whether the thief is even able to transfer ownership of his property. Related, it said, if a man tells another that he's about to buy a field, and when he does, it'll retroactively transfer ownership to the other man, this is valid, and when the first man buys the field, the second man would acquire it. Apparently, this would apply even to a specified field, as this is in accordance with the opinion that a person can acquire an item that doesn't yet exist, which is sourced from some laws of betrothal. It's further held, if deeds of transfer are found in a marketplace, they should in fact be returned to their original owners. This is further discussed, and others say a promissory note in a marketplace should not be returned. It's debated when this would apply. There are related points on court oaths discussed. It's also said if somebody finds a promissory note in a marketplace, it's only if it's certified and also dated to that day he should return it. This is because it was shown to be used as it's certified and not yet repaid as it's on the same day. This point is qualified further. It's also said if a man claims he repaid a debt that's owed by rabbinic law without any evidence, he's not believed, as an owed debt in such circumstance is viewed as if the other man had a promissory note with him. It debates as to what this encompasses regarding marriage contracts and similar. It's discussed further along with additional points on collecting a marriage contract payment when the actual kisobo marriage contract does not exist, which was permissible in some unique circumstances as a court enactment. The Mishnah, if somebody found a divorce document, an emancipation document, a will or a receipt or a gift document, they should not be returned, as there's a possibility their owner wrote them and then changed their mind about delivering them. The Gemara says the implication is that if the writer specifically said that this document should be delivered to its recipient, the finder should do that, no longer how much time has passed. There's variation on this, as discussed more in detail in Tractate Bava Metzia about finding a lost divorce document, as to how much time can pass before it's delivered, whether there's a concern it's somebody else's divorce document, depending on if it's in a caravan or not. There's further discussion on these points. Specifically, it said, if somebody finds a lost divorce document, if the husband said to deliver it to his wife, he must do so. If he did not, he should not return it to either of them. It's discussed as to why this is different from a promissory note. Regarding the document of emancipation, it said, if the owner said he's freeing the slave, the document should be returned to the slave. If he did not, it should not be returned to anybody. There's no concern of the slave's purchased properties in the interim being repossessed due to an outdated emancipation document, as either we hold his signed emancipation doesn't occur retroactively, or it's because when the slave repossesses his property, he needs to show proof as to when he was emancipated to show when it happened in accordance with his purchases. It also explains the difference between a will, which takes place after death, and a gift, which takes place from today and after death, if written in order to specify that it should only be given after death. Again, some say these actually should be returned if the writers had to deliver them. It's debated and it's explained that there's a difference if a gift was given by a sick person on their deathbed, which can be retracted, and a gift given by a healthy person, which cannot be retracted, and therefore should not be returned to prevent potential issues. Others disagree and say both refer to a gift given on a deathbed. It's just that the opinion which said the document should be returned is where the writer said to give it, and the other is where the writer died, so it can't be retracted, and his son said to give it. So it's not returned to prevent issues of the son changing the gift recipient and similar. By the receipt for a marriage contract, if the wife admits she was paid, it should be returned to the husband. If she does not, it should not be returned at all. Evidently, there's no concern of the receipt being outdated and used to pay for purchases, and then later have the purchases repossessed, as the woman has the right to forgive her marriage contract debt, so this wouldn't strictly be illegal. Others disagree with this principle. New Mishnah. If somebody found documents of appraisal of property, documents of provisions of sustenance, a chalisa document, a meal document, a berurin document, which will be defined, or other court enactments, he should return it. If somebody found documents in a container or 3 rolled together, he should return them. Some say if a document is of one person borrowing from 3 men, he returns it to the borrower. If the document is of 3 people borrowing from 1 man, he returns it to the lender. If somebody finds a document amongst his own piles of documents and he's not sure what it's for, it should be left in stasis until Mashiach comes. If he finds the cancellation of the contract, he should follow what it says. The Gemara debates as to what this berurin document that was mentioned was. Some say it's a document to clarify litigants' claims, others say it's a document of litigants choosing a judge. It cites cases regarding these principles. It also defines the document containers and what constitutes a rolled document as opposed to a bundle of documents, depending on how it's rolled up. And it can be declared vaguely to allow somebody to provide signs of evidence to claim the document. It clarifies the remaining point from the Mishnah. Regarding the cancellation of a contract document, such a document is discussed. It said it's certified by its signers. If it has none, but it comes from a third party or under the actual promissory note, it is valid, as this lends it credibility. And that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Bava Metzia continues discussing the laws of finding and caring for lost objects. The first Mishnah says, it gives a list of items which, if found, belong to the finder, according to Rabbi Meir, which are scattered produce, scattered coins, bundles of grain in a public domain, cakes of pressed figs, baker's loaves, strings of fish, cuts of meat, unprocessed wool directly from shearing, bound flax, and bound straps of purple wool. Rabbi Yehuda says, if an item is found, and it has some sort of an identifying mark called a simun, a unique factor of some sort, such as a cake of figs with an earthenware shard pressed inside, or a loaf of bread with coins inside, the finder must return these items. Others say if there's an anpuria vessel, which will be defined later, it does not need to be returned. The Gemara defines what constitutes scattered produce. It's said to be 1 kav, which was an old form of measurement, spread out over an area of 4 by 4 cubits. Typically, the difference would just be whether the produce looks intentionally placed or not, so it defines this case as grain on a threshing floor, meaning if it's over an area of 4 cubits, its original owner would not bother to expend effort to gather it, and he would therefore renounce his ownership. If it's within a smaller area, then it would be easy to regather, and the owner would plan on returning to take it, so the finder would not be allowed to take it for himself. Based on this, if a half kav was scattered across 2 by 4 cubits, it's a debate if the owner would bother regathering them, and whether therefore a finder can or cannot claim it for himself. On the one hand, they're scattered across a small area, so it would be easy to pick up, but there's also a small amount of produce with a low value, so perhaps they would not be regathered. Similarly, if there's 2 kav across 4 by 8 cubits, on the one hand it would take a lot of effort to regather, and on the other hand it's a lot of value. Similarly, if there's sesame seeds spread out across 4 by 4 cubits, they're expensive, so they might be regathered, but they're also really difficult to regather, so perhaps not. Similarly, if a kav of dates or pomegranates are scattered across 4 by 4 cubits, they're inexpensive, so might not be regathered, and can be taken by the finder, but they're also easy to regather, so perhaps the owner would take them. All of these cases go unresolved. As a general principle, if somebody gives up hope of recovering their lost object, it can then be claimed by whoever finds it. However, if somebody isn't even aware that he lost his item, but if he was, he would have given up on it, it's a debate if this is considered to be giving up on the item, meaning it can then be claimed by others. This would not apply if the item had an identifying mark, as then he wouldn't have been allowed to claim it in the first place. However, if it had an identifying mark and it had been swept away by a river, as will be discussed later, it can be taken if found. So the debate by an unknowingly lost object that theoretically would be given up on is if it had no distinguishing identifying marks, and the debate is either that he's just not aware that he lost it, so he hasn't given up on it, or if he was aware, then he would have given up on it. It tries to prove this from a number of different sources. It said that scattered produce can be collected by the finder, implying if they were unknowingly lost and would have been given up on, it can be kept, but that's answered as we had said previously. It's a case of somebody who left with their grain, meaning it was a conscious loss. fine, but we also said if somebody finds scattered money, presumably unknowingly lost and given up on, he can keep them. But again, no, that's considered to be a conscious loss, as people frequently check their wallets, so he probably noticed was missing and give up on it consciously. Same principle, but being able to keep pressed figs or baker's loaves, as mentioned, again, it's a conscious loss, not an unconscious one, as they're heavy, and he would have realized he had dropped them. And finally, by strips of purple wool, they're also not considered to be an unconscious loss, as they're significant and expensive, so the owner would have realized if he had dropped them, similar to the coins. It debates additional proofs from laws of regathering field charity tithes, figs falling from trees, and otherwise, as to if somebody who unknowingly lost an item, if he can unconsciously then give up on it. This is further debated from additional sources on separating truma ties and otherwise. It does, however, conclusively prove that unconsciously giving up on an item does not legally constitute giving up on an item, uniquely holding like the opinion of Abaya over Rava, one of the few times we do so. This would mean if there's a case like fruits blown off of a tree, they're still allowed to be eaten, as the owner actually does consciously give up on them, as he thinks bugs would have eaten them. There's no presumption that these belong to minor orphans who can't give up ownership of their properties, and if there was offense, then this would not apply. Anyways, the Mishnah had specified that if somebody finds bundles of grain, he can keep them. It's debated if this would apply even if there is an identifying mark on it, based on whether an identifying mark that is prone to be trampled and destroyed is considered to be a valid identifying mark. It debates it from various sources. This is discussed further at length, and it also debates as to the validity of an identifying mark that could come about on its own. It's also stated if a man declares his disappointment in the monetary loss from his lost item, he is considered to have given up hope on the item. It's said that the law regarding finding bundled grain is that if the grain is in a public domain or in a secluded area, but it looks like it just fell like that, he can keep them. If they look like they were intentionally placed there, he needs to declare as find. If there's an identifying mark on the item, no matter how or where he finds it, he needs to declare as find. It was said earlier, if somebody finds a string of fish, he can keep it. In this case, the knot and amount of fish don't act as identifying marks, as it's the standard type of knot and fish amount related. It's said that typically weight, measurements, and amount can all act as viable identifying marks. By cuts of meat, an identifying mark would be if it's cut into a unique shape, for instance. Regarding seals on barrels, as a debate, some say it's a viable identifying mark, others say it's only viable if it's still held by the manufacturers. Some say that naming a specific location is not a valid identifying mark, as multiple people could have placed their items there. It's had related incidents on this. We said earlier, a person can keep lost Anpuria vessels. It's explained what these vessels exactly are, which are brand new vessels that their owners would have a difficult time recognizing with no identifying marks. These are unique, as regular people wouldn't be trusted to say they recognize them to have them returned, while Torah scholars specifically are more trustworthy and could have them returned. Related, there are only 3 things a Torah scholar is permitted to ever deviate from the truth in. He can be humble and say he's learned less than he actually had. He can say he didn't sleep in a bed with an emission to save himself from embarrassment. And lastly, he can say a host had not treated him well so as to prevent people from harassing the host to stay by them. So if a Torah scholar is typically very honest and the only thing he ever deviates from the truth in is on those unique 3 things, he's trusted to be believed to identify a lost object based on visible recognition. There's a story where a silver goblet went missing and had been stolen. A sage watched and saw a student wash his hands and wipe them on somebody else's cloak, so he realized that that man didn't care about other people's property, interrogated him, and found out that he was the thief of the silver goblet. It is clarified that there are types of brand new vessels that could be reclaimed by their owner if they were seen for long enough that they could be recognized, and it gives instances of types of these vessels. It's also said if a person rescues a lost item from a lion, bear, or other wild animal, or from an ocean or a flooded river, or in a main thoroughfare, or a large plaza, or a large public place, he gets to keep the item, as the owner probably gave up on it. Regarding finding a lost object in a large public place, it debates if this would apply in a location with majority Jewish people or with majority non-Jewish people. This is argued from many sources. It debates this additionally from many discussions, and it also cites related issues with finding unidentified meat if it's presumed to be kosher based on the location and majority of the population. New Mishnah. Now, a list of items which are found that need to be returned. Produce found inside a vessel, a plain vessel, coins inside a pouch or a plain pouch, piles of produce, piles of coins, 3 coins stacked atop each other, bundles of grain in a secluded area, homemade loaves of bread, wool fleeces from a craftsman, jugs of wine, and jugs of oil. All of these need to be returned if found. The Gemara says, the implication is that if somebody finds a vessel or a pouch with produce or coins next to them, he can keep it. However, it said that if somebody finds an object with an identifying mark next to an item without one, he needs to proclaim both. If the owner takes only the item with the identifying mark, the finder can keep the other one. So it's explained this is referring to if somebody finds a container next to flax, meaning if the flax is completely out of the container, it's valid to assume that they were lost by the same person, as the flax is entangled as a single entity, which could have all just fallen out. However, if somebody finds a basket next to produce, as mentioned above, and the produce is completely outside the basket, it's unlikely that if it was lost by one person, all the produce would entirely spill out. So you could assume the produce was lost by a different person in the basket and can therefore keep the produce. So that explains the seeming contradiction. Alternatively, both deal with baskets and produce, and the difference if the produce must be returned along with the basket is if there's still produce left inside. Alternatively, both deal with the basket having produce left inside, and the difference is whether the basket is facing the produce or not. Or both are where the baskets are facing the spilled produce. It's just one has a rim, so nothing from the basket should have been able to spill out, and the other is where it does not have a rim, so it's valid to assume all of its own produce could have fallen out. It was said piles of produce or coins must be returned. It's argued whether this teaches that amounts or locations are considered to be valid identifying marks. It was said a pile of coins refers to a tower-like stack of 3. It's debated this encompasses other unique piles of coins. Some say you only need to return them if it's a pile of 3 stacked different types of coins, getting progressively smaller to the top. That would be considered a pile that was specifically left as an identifying mark. Anything else is considered to have fallen at random and can be kept. According to those that say he's returning the pile of coins, it argues how he requests an identifying mark. It said that he should announce that he found coins and people should provide how much they had lost. 3 is a minimum, as if it was 2, he'd be saying he found coins, plural, which at a minimum means 2. It also asks what if the coins are arranged in a circle, a line, a triangle. It is said that if it's arranged like a staircase, he must return it based on the fact that it said if all the coins in the structure could be lifted at once with a stick, they must be returned. If the coins were arranged in the manner of the service of the idol Marcellus, which will be discussed more in Tractate Bava Metzia, but probably refers to the idol Mercury, which is in a triangle with 3 coins like this, he must return them. Generally, it said a singular coin can't really have any identifying marks, even if it has the guy's name on it, as it's possible that the guy owned it, then spent it, and that other man lost it, and now he's trying to get his own coin back. New Mishnah. If somebody finds bound fledgling birds behind a fence or on a field path, he can't take them, as apparently they were just left there intentionally. If somebody finds a vessel in a garbage dump, if it's concealed, he should not touch it, as apparently it's intentionally being hidden there. If it's not concealed, he must announce the item. The Gemara explains by the bound birds he shouldn't take them, as there are no identifying marks for the owner to be able to reclaim them with. The knot would not work, as it's a standard bird tying knot, and the location isn't a valid identifying mark, as it's possible they had moved from their location to this one, so it's uncertain if the bird's placement was deliberate, and in an uncertain case, it initially shouldn't be touched, although if he did, he doesn't need to return it. It also clarifies by a garbage heap, he can't touch the item if it's a large item like a container or a cup. If it was something small like knives or forks, you need to try to return it. Others say the differences between an item found in a garbage dump that is not cleared out that he should not touch, and one that was found in a dump that was later designated to be cleared out that he must announce, and this is qualified. New Mishnah. If somebody finds a lost object inside rubble or inside an old wall, he can keep it. If it was from a new wall, if the item was from the midpoint of the wall and out, he can keep it. If it was from the middle of the wall in, it goes to the owner of the house. If the house was rented to many people, he can just keep it, as the owner would have given up on it. The Gemara clarifies, finding an item in an old wall can be kept, as it could have been left by the ancient Ammonites, so long as it's very rusted, at least. If there's an item found inside a new wall, it said a knife or pouch go in accordance to where their handle or laces face. If they face towards the house owner gets to keep it. If they face towards the wall, the finder gets to keep it. Checking if the item is past the midpoint or not, that would apply to items like strips of metal or cloth. If there's a hollow in a wall filled with items, even if it's slanted in either direction, it would be divided equally between the house owner and finder. Regarding the point that if somebody finds an item in a wall and the house was rented to many people, the finder can keep it. It discusses why this item wouldn't just go to the last renter, as a similar concept exists by finding coins in a street in Jerusalem. If it's a holiday, they're presumed to be tithe coins, as the streets are cleaned frequently, and it would go by what was last there. It's explained that this rented house was an inn to several people, 3, and it debates if the cases where they're Jewish or non-Jewish as to whether this would cause the owner to give up on the item. If 3 people are walking and one of them loses a coin, the finder does not need to return it, as presumably the owner gives up on it. However, if the coin is worth 3 perotes, 1 for each person, some say he should return it, as it's possible all 3 of them are partners and jointly own the coin and would not give up on the item. Some even say this would apply if the coin is worth 2 perotes, as it's possible one of them gave up his share to another. If a man sees another drop a coin and he steals it before the man gives up on it, it then lists all of the biblical obligations that he's just violated of theft and similar that apply even if he returns it. If he took the coin with intent to return it and then after the man gives up he intends to steal it, that's a violation of the commandment. If a man waits until somebody gives up on a lost item and only then takes the coin for himself, he's violating a commandment. It's said if a man loses a coin in sand, another man can take it without returning it, as the man would have given up on it. This would apply even if he sees the man searching through the sand, as it's likely he's just searching for something else so as to offset his loss. New Mishnah, if somebody finds a lost item in a store, he can keep it. If the item was between the storekeeper's counter and the storekeeper, it belongs to the storekeeper, as customers don't typically enter that area. If somebody finds lost coins before a money changer, he can keep them. If they're between the money changer's chair and the money changer, they belong to the money changer, as again, customers don't typically enter that area. If somebody bought produce or was given a gift and he finds coins within this pile, he can keep them. If they're wrapped in a bundle, that's considered to be a valid identifying mark, and he needs to return them. The Gemara debates from implication of various sources as to whether lost coins found directly upon the desk of a money changer, if the finder can keep them. The point that if a man finds coins amongst produce, he can keep them, that applies if he bought them from a market. If he got them from a single person, he should return it to that man. There's no concern of a man's slave having harvested the produce and losing his coins, as if it's a Canaanite slave, the coins belong to the owner anyways. New Mishnah. This verse specifies that a person must return lost garments, among other particularities. Garments are specified as they have identifying marks, and also people trying to claim them, so anything with those 2 attributes must be declared so as to return. The Gemara further qualifies the verse as to why each thing is specified. It specifies garments, as there can be identifying marks on the item itself. Donkeys are specified as identifying marks can be brought on accessories to the item, the saddle and similar. Oxen and sheep are specified to show that they must be returned even alongside their sheared wool. Others debate this derivation and offer other suggestions. It debates other verses which show that an item does not need to be returned if its value is less than that of a perota, which is the smallest denomination of coin, and it debates what if the value dropped, whether this would matter when the item was found, or lost, or the time in between. It's debated if returning items based on an identifying mark, if this is based on rabbinic or biblical law. There's a practical difference by returning a divorce document, something non-monetary, based off of an identifying mark. It debates this from a great number of sources. Some do say that identifying marks are a biblical principle, so if 2 different people bring identifying marks on a lost item, it shouldn't be returned to either of them. If one man brings identifying marks and the other brings 2 witnesses, it goes to the man with the witnesses. If one man brings identifying marks and the other brings identifying marks and the single witness just doesn't matter, so the finder keeps it. If there's a lost garment and one man brings witnesses that the garment had been woven for him, and another brings witnesses that he had lost the item, it goes to the second one, as it's possible that the first man had actually owned it but sold it to the second man. If there's a lost garment and one man gives the width as an identifying mark and the other gives the length, the width can be approximated by seeing it, so it's given to the man who gave the length, as that's a measurement which more accurately proves his ownership. If one man gives the measurement of the width and also the length, and another man gives the measurement of the length and width combined, it goes to the first man. If one man gives the measurements of the width and length and one man gives the weight, it goes to the man with the weight, which is harder to approximate. If there's a lost divorce document and the husband provides identifying marks for the document and the wife also does this, it goes to the wife. The identifying mark must be something that requires them to have held the document to see it, such as a hole inside of the document. If both the man and woman identify it based on the string tying the document, it goes to the woman, and the identification would be the length of the string, which can only be measured if, as mentioned, they'd actually held the document. If the man and woman identify the document that it came in a case, it goes to the husband, as the wife could have just known he generally keeps important documents in cases. New Mishnah. There's a debate as to how long a person needs to proclaim a lost item for. Some say it's until his neighbors become aware of the lost item. Others say for 3 pilgrimage holidays plus 7 days, for 3 days to return home from Jerusalem, realize he had lost something, and then come back to Jerusalem for 3 days, and then 1 more day to declare that he had lost the item. The Gemara clarifies, neighbors becoming aware of the lost item refers to the neighbors around where the lost item was found. The other opinion says it was until 3 pilgrimage holidays, and an additional 7 days after to give time for the owner of the lost item to travel home and back. However, it mentioned in Tractate Tainus, an earlier tractate regarding delaying praying for rain, that it takes 15 days to travel back. It's explained the differences. The journey took 15 days during the first temple period and 3 days during the second temple period. It's debated if this is because there was a difference in population density between temples, or possibly as it was the same there. It's just that they made it a lesser number of days by returning lost items so that people wouldn't need to wait an excessive amount of time. Based on these specifications, a person shouldn't just broadly announce that he had found the lost item, as otherwise it would take additional days for people to even recognize which item they had lost. Rather, if somebody finds a cloak, they announce they found a cloak, and the other owner needs to provide actual identifying marks. As he is declaring the lost item between 3 pilgrimage holidays, he declares it at the first pilgrimage holiday, he declares it by the second holiday, and then by the third holiday, he just declares it without specifying the holiday, in case somebody misheard and thinks he had said it was the second holiday. Anyways, all this proclamation was when the temple stood. After it was destroyed, it was instituted instead that lost items should be declared in synagogues and study halls, and then when times got even more difficult and lost items would just be confiscated and given to the king, it was instituted to be sufficient to just inform neighbors and acquaintances. It used to be that there was a special stone in Jerusalem called the Claimant's Stone, where people would stand and declare lost items. New Mishnah. It's required for people to not just identify the type of lost item to claim it, but also to bring identifying marks. If the person trying to claim it is a known swindler, it should not be given to him even if he brings identifying marks. The Gemara says, it's a debate if somebody declares that he found the lost item in general, or what he lost actually, like a cloak, depending on if there's a concern that this will allow swindlers to then steal the item. This is debated from a few sources. It was later instituted that a person wanting to claim a lost item needs to provide witnesses that he wasn't a swindler, as they became too much of an issue. It gives instances of this. New Mishnah. If somebody finds a lost animal, he needs to hold on to it until he can return it, and animals cost money to take care of. So if the animal can work and pay for itself, he should hold on to it and use its work to pay for its own food. If the animal does not work and does not earn money and he can't afford to hold on to it, he should sell it and hold on to the money to return. It's a debate if he can use this money as he waits, and if he can, he'd need to pay restitution if it gets lost, otherwise he would not. The Gemara says, if the animal pays for itself through its work, he still only needs to hold on to it for 12 months before he sells it and holds on to the money. Calves and foals that graze in pastures should be held onto for 3 months before they're sold. If they need to be fattened, they're held onto for 30 days. Large geese and roosters should be held onto for 30 days before they're sold. If they're small, then 3 days. Chickens fall into the category of an animal that works as they lay eggs. If it's an animal that eats and does not work, he should sell it and hold on to the value. If he's holding on to the calf or foal or rooster or otherwise, he should try not to spend the total value of the animal to feed it, otherwise the owner will just get nothing when he returns it. It qualifies the debate as to if the finder can benefit from the money taken from the animal sale in the interim. It does say it's ruled in accordance with the opinion that the money can be used in the interim. This is unique, as he had to take care of the animal for a period. If somebody just finds lost coins, then he can't use those. New Mishnah. If somebody finds lost scrolls, he needs to read them every 30 days, opening and going through the scrolls so that way they don't rot. But he also shouldn't study them at length, or else they might be damaged. He should also read the scroll by himself, as a second person might pull the scroll and then tear it. If somebody finds a garment, he needs to shake it and spread it out every 30 days so that way it won't go bad. But he can't use it as a decoration for his own prestige. If somebody finds silver or copper vessels, you can use them so that way they won't rust, but not to the point where they'll get damaged. If somebody finds gold vessels, he can't touch them, and he just needs to wait until their owner is identified. If somebody finds a basket or a sack that would be embarrassing for him to carry, he doesn't need to take it home to return, if it'll be embarrassing for him to take it. The Gemara says, if somebody finds tefillin, he can keep them and swap them for money. This is unlike scrolls, which need to be kept and cared for, as tefillin were pretty common and Torah scrolls were not. Similarly, if a person borrows a Torah scroll, he can't lend it to a third person, and he needs to take care of the scroll in a similar manner, opening it and being careful not to damage it, although it debates as to how often this should be done. It specifies a Torah scroll specifically cannot be lent to additional people, which is seemingly redundant, as it was stated in Tractate Gittin on page 29a, that a borrower or renter cannot lend or rent their items to an additional third person. So it restated this by a Torah scroll, as people might think you could lend a Torah scroll to a third person as it's for a mitzvah, so it says it's not allowed. It clarifies the remaining points that it must be opened in a manner that keeps it safe without causing any damage. It said it should be unrolled every 30 days, whether it's a new or old scroll. It said 2 people cannot read the same scroll in case they tear it. This is if they're reading 2 separate parts. If they're both reading the same portion, then it would be allowed. A garment should be shaken every 30 days. Another source says that would actually damage it, but it's explained that's referring to shaking it daily. Others say it refers to 2 people shaking it. Others say it refers to shaking with a stick. That'll damage it. Others say it's good to shake it if it's a wool garment and bad if it's linen. It gives some general practical advice on tools or garments that are preferable for use. It was said that garments must be spread out, but not for the benefit of the finder. It debates it's allowed to spread out a garment for both to benefit the garment, but also for the man's prestige. It's debated from a number of different sources. Further, wood vessels can be used so as to keep them from deteriorating. Copper vessels should be used with hot water, but not directly on fire. Silver vessels should be used with cold water. Rakes and axes should be used against soft substances, but not against hard ones. And gold vessels just should not be used. All of these should also be done if an item was deposited to somebody and the owner is overseas. It was said, if it would be embarrassing to take a lost item, he doesn't need to do it, and it brings sources. This would apply if the man is a Kohen and the lost item is in a graveyard, or if the man is old and it would be beneath his dignity to carry it, or if the labor to take it would cost more than the item itself. It further sources these points. If an item would be returned by an item in a field, but not if it was in a city where there are more people, then in that case it's left unresolved. Others rule if a person would recover the item if it was his own, he must recover it for others. Similarly, if a person would have loaded and unloaded his own animal, he must do the same for other people. It cites instances of these principles. New Mishnah. An animal is not considered to be lost property if it's just grazing along a path. If there's a donkey with its equipment overturned or a cow that ran through a vineyard, that's considered to be lost property. If somebody finds a lost animal and returns it, and then it escapes and he returns it again, and it escapes and he returns it again, he needs to keep on returning it no matter how many times he finds it. If, when returning a lost item, he's going to be leaving work, he's only repaid for the labor of recovering the item, not for his lost income. He can get repaid for lost income if he stipulates it before a court of 3 men. If there's no court and he's going to have a serious financial loss if he recovers the item, he doesn't need to take it. The Gemara clarifies that those are examples of when to and when not to return a lost item. If somebody sees an animal grazing out by day, it's not considered to be lost. If it's by night, it should be returned. If it's seen by dawn or by dusk, it should be returned after 3 days. It's also said, if a cloak or axe are found on a main thoroughfare or a cow running in a vineyard, it's considered to be a lost item. If the cloak or axe are lying against the fence or the cow is grazing in the vineyard, it's not considered to be lost. If they're left for 3 days in a row, they would be considered to be lost. It's also said, if a man sees water flowing towards somebody's field to flood it, he should stop it with a barrier to preserve the sheaves. There's an apparent contradiction in the Mishnah. It said if a cow is grazing on a path, it's not lost property, implying if it runs on a path or grazes in a vineyard, it would be lost property. And then it said if a cow runs through a vineyard, it's considered to be lost property, implying that if it runs on a path or grazes in a vineyard, it's not. It's debated. Some say they don't contradict. They're saying the same would apply by other similar cases. Others say there's literally a difference where the animal is running on a path and it's lost property, is specifically where it's running to a field and from a city, and where it's running on a path and is not lost property is where it's running to a city from a field. This is explained that when it references grazing in a vineyard being lost, it actually references loss as in damage to a field and property. This is additionally qualified. Regarding returning a lost animal multiple times, it explains this is referring to returning it to protected property, and this is done even if the owner is unaware of you returning the animal. It brings a number of verses and sources and expounds on them. It discusses derivation from a number of related verses. It was also said, if a person needs to leave his job to recover a lost item, he's not paid for his lost wages. He's paid for his labor, which is clarified here to be as an idle laborer, meaning payment to be willing to not work for his current wage. It was stated that he could get paid in full for his lost wages if he convenes with a court of 3 men, and it gives instances of this concept. This is discussed further. New Mishnah. If somebody finds an animal in a stable, he should not return it. If he finds an animal in a public area, he returns it. If the animal was lost in a graveyard, a Kohen cannot return it, as he's impermissibly then become impure, and it's not allowed even if his father tells him to do so. If somebody sees an animal struggling under the weight of its load, he must help to unload it, and if it's reloaded and seen to struggle, he must help it again and again as many times as necessary. You do not need to help unload an animal if its own owner refuses to assist, unless the man's old and sick. There's a biblical obligation to help unload an animal, and it's debate if there's an obligation to help load an animal. This concept of helping unburden an animal applies if it's carrying its typical load weight and not a larger amount. The Gemara clarifies the stable reference in the Mishnah that you don't return an animal from is one that doesn't encourage the animal to stay or to secure it there either. The stable is said to be within the outside Techum border around the city. If it's in a public domain, even within the Techum boundary, it must be returned. Others say the implication is that if the animal is in a stable beyond the city limits, it should be returned. The reason a Kohen does not need to listen to his father's commandment to enter a graveyard is because honoring a father is only a positive commandment, while a Kohen not entering a graveyard is both a positive and negative commandment, so it has priority. It discusses sources and also those for the obligation to help people unload and load their animals. It debates as to why this principle exists. It is said that the obligation to help unload animals apply to helping both Jewish people and non-Jewish people. So some say this means the source is as the requirement is to help prevent any animal from suffering, no matter who owns it. Others say the requirement is to help non-Jewish people's animals is just for the sake of harmony. It debates this from various other sources. This is based on whether the obligation to not be cruel to animals is one of biblical or rabbinic law. It argues this further. New Mishnah. If somebody finds his own lost item and his father or teacher's lost item, his own lost item takes precedence. If somebody finds his father and teacher's lost item, his teacher's lost item takes precedence. As his father brought him into the world, well, his teacher helps bring him to the world to come. If his father is a Torah scholar, however, his father would take priority. Similarly, between a father or teacher regarding helping with either of burdens or redeeming them from captivity, the teacher takes priority, unless the father is a Torah scholar. The Gemara cites sources. There's also debates as to what constitutes a teacher here, depending on what level he's taught, and further on the obligations of honoring your teachers. It's said that a teacher here that you must respect is according to the opinion that this encompasses a man who taught you even a single Mishnah. It clarifies additional priorities of learning, and further on the great importance and value of learning Torah. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Bava Metzia continues on further laws on the recovery and returning of lost or stolen objects. The first mention says, if somebody deposits an animal or vessels with somebody, an unpaid guardian, and the item gets lost or stolen, the guardian can either repay the value of the item and not need to take an oath that he was not negligent, or he can take such an oath and then be released from liability of payment. If the thief is found, the thief must pay double. If it was a sheep or an ox and the thief slaughtered or sold it, he must pay excess 4 times or 5 times, and the payment goes to the guardian if he had repaid the owner for the item. If the guardian hadn't repaid the owner and had taken an oath that he wasn't responsible, the excess double or 4 or 5 times payments would go to the original owner. The Gemara says it mentioned both an animal and a vessel, as animals are difficult to carry and care for, so it shows the payments are the same for both. It discusses this point further. It's debated if it's sufficient for the guardian to just agree to pay for the stolen animal for him to acquire any later returning payments, meaning to not actually pay it, he's only consenting to, verbally. Similarly, if the guardian agrees that he was negligent and accepts responsibility, future payments would go to him as they would if he was a paid guardian who states that the item was stolen, accepting responsibility. A borrower who lost an item would not be able to choose to pay and thereby acquire any future recompense. A borrower could only exempt himself from payment if he says something unusual to destroy the item, such as the animal died during the course of ordinary work. Others say a borrower actually would acquire any future payments if he agrees to pay, and according to others, when he actually pays it. It debates this from various sources. It is agreed if a guardian initially refuses to pay and then agrees to. If the thief pays a double payment, it goes to the guardian, as he had eventually agreed to pay for the stolen item. However, if the guardian initially agreed to pay for it and then refused to, it debates if this is considered to be retracting his statement, removing it, or only postponing it. It's a similar debate if the guardian agreed to pay for the stolen item and then passed, and his sons then refused to. It's a debate if this is a retraction or only a postponing. Additionally, if the father passes and the sons do end up paying for the item, it's a debate if the owner is obligated to transfer the rights to the sons also, when he had only agreed to do so by the father. There are several other particularly posed scenarios which all go unresolved. It's debated as to why and when exactly a guardian would need to take an oath. This is discussed further. There's a case a man gave jewels to a guardian, and later the guardian claimed he wasn't sure what happened to the jewels. It was ruled that this was considered to be negligence and he had to repay. The guardian refused to pay, and it was said that the sum could be taken from the guardian's property. The jewels were then eventually found and had increased in value, so were returned and the guardian got back his property. This is different from the established principle of a guardian who refused to take responsibility through an oath, as the guardian here inconvenienced the owner to go to court. It is ruled if somebody in debt had his item appraised and then confiscated, when it's eventually returned after he repays his debt, the actual confiscated item must be returned. It qualifies these points. If a creditor repossessed a borrower's land, it's a debate between a number of opinions when he can consume the produce from the land, whether from when he receives a document of authorization, whether it's from the signing of the document, or otherwise. New Mishnah. If somebody rented a cow and then lent it to a different borrower, and the cow died in an ordinary manner, the renter would take an oath as to how things occurred, and the borrower would repay the renter. Others say the value of the cow is actually repaid to the original owner. The Gemara explains the renter here would be acquiring the animal as it dies, and he takes an oath to assure the owner as to how it died. It poses a case if a renter rents a cow for 100 days, and then the owner borrows it back for 90 days, and then the renter rents it for 80 days, and the owner then borrows it back for 70 days, and the animal dies within the 7-day period, for every time the animal is borrowed, the owner owes 1 cow. It debates this from other opinions. Additional related cases are discussed, and these are qualified further. It debates further if we hold in accordance with the opinion that if a guardian pays for a lost deposit and he doesn't take an oath, the thief's double payment would nevertheless go to the owner, which is based on the Mishnah's wording. New Mishnah. If a man admits to 2 people that he stole 100 dinarim from one of them, but he's just not sure which, or that one of their fathers had deposited 100 coins with him, but he's just not sure which, he would be obligated to give 100 dinarim to both of them. This is because he's not sure who he owes the money to, but he admitted his guilt by himself, so he's liable to pay both of them. If 2 men deposited money to one man, one depositing 100 dinarim and the other 200, and then they both claim that they deposited the 200 dinarim, the guardian should give 100 dinarim to both of them, and then just hold the doubtful 100 coins in stasis until Mashiach comes. Others disagree, saying the attempted thief here has no loss, so he'd say the entire amount should be held in stasis until Mashiach comes. Similarly, if 2 people deposit vessels with somebody, one worth 100 dinarim and the other worth 1,000, and then they both claim they deposited the more expensive vessel, the guardian should give the cheaper vessel to one and take proceeds from the expensive one and give the value of the cheaper vessel and then keep the remainder from the expensive vessel in stasis until Mashiach comes. Others say again, the attempted thief here would have no loss, so he'd say the entire amount of everything should be held in stasis until Mashiach comes. The Gemara suggests, based on the initially established case from the Mishnah, that in cases of uncertainty, evidently, the money does not just stay with its current owner, rather it's divided up, which is by a deposit, and then is contradicted by the latter case of the Mishnah. It debates this from other sources, including a point from Tractate Bava Metzia, where it says that if a thief has 5 people claiming he owes them money, he should just leave the amount to be split between them, which is seemingly contradictory, so it's explained there. The others are demanding payment, but in our Mishnah, where he's paying everybody in full, it's where he's voluntarily choosing to pay everybody, as implied by the Mishnah itself. It discusses this further, citing additional sources from other locations. New Mishnah, if somebody deposits produce with a guardian, even if the item starts spoiling, he shouldn't touch it. Others say he should just sell it before a court so as to be able to save the produce as if he's returning the item. The Gemara explains, the reason the first opinion holds he shouldn't replace the produce is either because generally people prefer their own produce than that of others, or the concern is that the second produce will be improperly tithed or otherwise made impure. Others debate the second issue as a concern. Additionally, the Mishnah's debate as to whether he should sell the produce is where the produce deteriorates at its standard rate. If it deteriorates faster than normal, it's agreed he should sell it before a court. It argues further as to what the circumstance is regarding if the concern is it being others' produce, or if the concern is that it's improperly tithed produce. It debates further as to which opinion we hold, as to whether the produce should be sold to be returned or not. This is discussed further, and there are related points on laws of property authorization. It brings a particular case. A woman had 3 daughters. She and one of her daughters were then taken captive, and one of the daughters had passed, leaving a minor son. So it's a debate where the property of the woman goes. The issue with it going to her daughter is that the woman could have possibly died in captivity, so her minor grandchild would then inherit from her, and the court doesn't authorize a relative to manage the boy's property. The issue with it going to the minor grandson is that it's possible the woman did not die in captivity, and the court does not authorize a minor to manage property of a captive. Some hold half goes to the daughter and half to a supervisor who will hold on to it for the son. Others say a supervisor just holds on to everything until the status of the woman is defined and known. In the particular case, it was eventually confirmed that the woman died, and some said a third goes to the surviving daughter, a third goes to the minor grandchild, and the last third, which should theoretically go to the captive daughter, is split, half of this third going to the remaining daughter and the other part going to a supervisor for the minor. Others hold the supervisor holds onto both halves of the captive daughter's sum. Another case is brought. An individual showed up to a town, went to a particularly wealthy man and claimed to be his long-lost brother, and demanded half of his property that he'd inherit. The wealthy man claimed to have no knowledge of this man. It was said, based on the whole incident with Joseph from the Torah, it's known that a man could just end up not recognizing his brothers, so it was said that the man claiming to be a brother had to bring witnesses for that fact. Eventually, witnesses were brought proving that he was the man's brother, and the property was divided accordingly. And as the brother was a minor, it was ruled that the property was divided, and if there were enhancements made to the property, it was divided and split. New Mishnah. If somebody deposits produce with another and the guardian returns a different produce, needs to repay the standard expected decreased amount of reduction in the produce from mice or otherwise. The standard produce loss ratios were for wheat and rice, 9.5 kav per 180 kav, which was an old form of measurement. For barley and millet, it was 9 kav per 180 kav. For spelt and flaxseed, it was 18 kav per 180 kav, according to its amount and time lapsed. Others agree and say that mice don't really care how much produce there is when they eat, so it doesn't go according to a ratio, it goes according to a set amount. Others say if it was a large amount of produce, there's no concern of standard produce loss, as the produce will actually increase, which will be explained. The Gemara qualifies these ratios for different types of produce, and it clarifies that those are the standard ratios per year. The answer to the opinion that mice would typically eat a set amount regardless of the ratios is that it discounts the amount of produce that gets additionally scattered. Furthermore, these produce loss calculations are only made if the produce was mixed with the guardian's own, and the guardian took an unknown amount. If they were set aside fully, the guardian could just say it's the depositor's loss if mice gets into them. Regarding a large measure, which is defined as 1800 kav, this would not have reduction calculated, as it could actually increase. For instance, if it's returned in the rainy season and the grain swells slightly, increasing the volume. New Mishnah. Similarly to the above, if liquids are being returned, there is an amount deducted for the standard loss over time, here through absorption and evaporation, of either a sixth or a fifth of the amount of wine, depending on the opinion. There's 3 lugs, which was an old measurement, of oil deducted for every 100 lug. There's 1.5 for sediment and 1.5 for absorption. If it was refined oil, there's no deduction for sediment. If the oil was stored in old saturated casks, there's no deduction for absorption. Others say there is a sediment deduction for refined oil. The Gemara says the debate if wine reduction is a sixth or a fifth. That's not a debate, it's just variance between different locales based on what material barrels were coated with. It further discusses these ratio calculations. Regarding old saturated casks, some say they do not absorb at all, as the barrels are also coated with pitch. Others say they're just fully saturated and can't absorb anything further. It further debates the opinions if there's sediment reduction by refined oil from some additional sources. New Mishnah. If somebody stored a barrel with a guardian in a non-specific location within his house, and the guardian then moves the barrel, and it breaks as he does so, if he moved it for his own sake, then he's liable. But if he moved it for the sake of the barrel, to protect it for instance, and it broke, he'd be exempt. If he had moved the barrel, and then it broke for whatever reason, he's exempt. If the owner had put the barrel in a designated specific place in his house, whether it broke as he moved it or after he'd moved it, he's liable if he moved it for himself, and exempt if it was to protect the barrel. The Gemara cites opinions this is in accordance with. It additionally qualifies the various opinions on this topic. There's also a debate as to whether if somebody impermissibly used an item, if he's now fully responsible for it and any damage that comes to it. For instance, normally if a shepherd is watching sheep and then leaves and then something outside his control occurs, like wolves appearing and eating the sheep, he's not responsible. However, if he had leaned his shepherd's staff on one of the sheep and it was attacked, he had made use of the item, so essentially he had accepted responsibility for it. So the case is actually defined that he struck the animal with his staff and weakened it, which means this opinion holds that misappropriating an item requires that there be a loss of some sort. Others debate this opinion. It argues this further. New Mishnah. If somebody deposited coins with a guardian, and the guardian did not do a very good job of keeping them safe, doing something like binding them in a cloth and slinging it behind him, or leaving them with his minor child, or locking them behind a door that's not very secure, he's liable for any loss or damages. If he did safeguard them properly, he's exempt. The Gemara explains all of the above listed methods of guarding money are considered to be improper, and slinging the coins in a cloth behind is improper as it should be held in your hands. It cites related points on guarding and protecting money. Some say the only proper way to guard money is to bury it. If somebody receives money just before Shabbos and then waits a while after Shabbos to bury the money and doesn't do immediately when he's allowed to, he would be liable. It would be permissible to delay if the owner of the money was a Torah scholar who perhaps needed the money for the Havdalah service, so it wouldn't need to be buried immediately. However, it eventually became common for thieves to dig around to find hidden money and also to search roof beams, so it's said to be proper to guard money by storing it inside of the wall, specifically near the ground or near the ceiling, where people wouldn't be able to check for hollow spots in the walls. It gives other instances of properly storing money and also rules. If the circumstances that the money was hidden in a somewhat negligent manner and then it was lost due to an accident, the guardian would be liable. It discusses a number of related incidents on this. New Mishnah. If a person deposits money with a money lender, but bound and sealed, the money lender cannot use it and would not be responsible for it. If it was unbound, the money lender can use it and is responsible for it. If the money was deposited with a non-money lender, just a typical person, he can't use it no matter what, so he's not responsible for it. Regarding a storekeeper, it's a debate if he has has the status of a typical person or of a moneylender. The Gemara says the moneylender can't use the bound money as it's sealed, so clearly it can't be used. It's debated if this refers to a money bag being sealed with an atypical knot. He would be responsible if the money was unbound, which would include things like losing the item, such as in a shipwreck. It debates the circumstance of these cases. New Mishnah. If somebody impermissibly used somebody's deposit, Beis Shammai says he's penalized for any increase or decrease in the funds. Beis Hillel says he must repay the funds according to the time it was removed. Rabbi Akiva says he must repay the funds according to the time of the claim. The Gemara says, some say if a man steals a barrel of wine worth 1 dinar, and it goes up in value to 4 dinarim, if the thief broke or drank it himself, he needs to repay 4 dinarim, and if the barrel broke by itself, he must repay 1 dinar. As was mentioned in Tractate Bava Metzia, the prior tractate, a stolen item must be repaid according to when it was stolen. It qualifies the remaining opinions. It does say the law accords with Rabbi Akiva that the fund is repaid according to the time of the claim, although it said that if there were witnesses at the time, it would be paid according to the time of the deposit. Others do say it's like the opinion of Beis Hillel. New Mishnah. If somebody wants to impermissibly use a deposit, Beis Shammai says he's just liable for any damages if he voices this desire. Beis Hillel says he's only liable if he actually impermissibly uses it. If somebody had a barrel of wine deposited by him, and he tilts it and drinks a quarter lug of wine, and the barrel breaks, he repays only for what he took. If he actually lifts up the entire barrel, he's acquired all of it, effectively, so if he drinks a quarter lug and the barrel breaks, he needs to repay for the whole thing. The Gemara cites sources for these opinions. Additionally, these points on repaying for a barrel are if it broke. If it's spoiled, that's a direct result of his action, so he'd be responsible for all of it. Some clarify if somebody lifts the barrel of wine in order to drink some and acquires it, he's liable if it breaks, even if he hasn't actually drunk any of it yet. This is as the small amount he wanted to drink is benefited by the entire barrel and all of the wine surrounding it, so he acquires the whole thing. It does ask if lifting a purse to take a single coin from the purse is comparable at all to this, possibly as a purse is more easily guarded than single coins, so they're benefited by the total amount, but it's left unresolved. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Bava Metzia continues going through the various laws of ownership and acquisitions. The first Mishnah says, there's a principle that giving the money for a purchase is not what creates the acquisition, rather it's only the actual taking of the item. So when two types of currency are exchanged, one currency will act as the purchasing money and the other acts as the acquired item. And the latter coins are the only ones which create the acquisition. So it said if somebody's purchasing gold coins with silver coins, the silver coins are considered to be money and the gold is considered to be the acquired item. If somebody purchases silver coins with copper, the silver coins still act as the money and the copper coins act as the acquisition. If flawed coins are exchanged for unflawed coins, the unflawed coins act as the money and the flawed coins create the acquisition. If minted coins are exchanged for unminted coins, the minted coins act as the money and the unminted coins create the acquisition. If coins are being exchanged for a movable property, the coins act as money and the property creates the acquisition. Broadly, if movable property is being exchanged for a movable property, the legal acquisition takes place when either party actually takes the item, meaning the sale can be reneged on up until that point. However, it does say if somebody uses this to try to get out of paying for things by illegally seizing property, then their punishment will come from heaven. Others say the advantage regarding the ability to renege on a sale goes to the person with the actual payment money at the time. The Gemara says, our Mishnah says that by a sale of gold for silver, the gold is the acquired item. Others had said the exact opposite, that the silver was the acquired item, as gold is more valuable, so perhaps it should be the currency. Then it was said that the gold should be the acquired item, as silver was a more readily accepted form of currency. It tries to bring proofs in accordance with both opinions, citing many various cases and debates in regard to different coin usage by tithes and redemptions and purchases and similar. One of such is a lengthy argument as to if it's permitted to take ma'is or sheni tithe fruits and deconsecrate them onto gold coins or copper coins. Others say this debate actually applies to deconsecrating silver ma'is or sheni tithe salatin coins onto gold coins. It does mention that the actual city of Jerusalem had more lenient laws of deconsecration within it. It does conclude that it's agreed between opinions that first money can be deconsecrated onto second coins, even outside of Jerusalem, but there are still unresolved difficulties with the wording. Now, some actually disagree with the principal point and say that coins actually cannot be used to acquire items. Those that say that this is forbidden is that the value of a coin is typically on the image or face of the coin, meaning the government backing of the currency essentially, which is subject to change. It debates this point from a number of different cases. Based on these opinions, it additionally debates whether a coin itself can be acquired through an acquisition. It is held that if a coin cannot be acquired through an acquisition, then it also can't acquire items. It further debates which is the case from additional locations. This point as to whether coins, currency, essentially can themselves be used to acquire or as an acquisition is argued on further from various cases. This is debated further. It also brings the concept of kinyan sodar, acquisition of an item via handing over a handkerchief, and it's an argument as to whose handkerchief should be used. This is argued from various points on property acquisition. Acquisitions can be created via utensils, even if they're less than the minimum value of a Purata coin. It's a debate if an acquisition can be done with produce based on a few conversations. Back towards the initial Mishnah, it gives a definition of unminted coins. It had stated that it's the giving of the merchandise that completes the sale, not the paying of the money. It's a debate if this is a biblical or rabbinic enactment. The logic of an enactment is so that people have an incentive to protect property that they're selling after it's sold, but before it's been actually given to the purchaser. Others say it's a biblical principle and it's based on a verse. It further explains this debate. It argues sources to try to prove either opinion as to if it's a biblical or a rabbinic enactment from various scriptural quotes and similar. It was stated in the Mishnah, if somebody reneged on a sale after being paid, he receives punishment from heaven. Now, some say the court just informs the man that heaven will punish him. Others say that the court actually curses him. It debates this from a number of sources. There's a related debate as to if a collateral affects the potential payment of an entire loan or only the value of the collateral, which is based on a broader argument on this topic. It quotes some particular incidents, and it discusses how and when reneging on verbal agreements creates a lack of trustworthiness based on a number of particular cases involving people reneging on their deals. It additionally qualifies the latter opinion that whoever has the money has the authority to renege on the deal. Mishnah now discussing the concept of overcharging and price fraud. Broadly, it's considered overcharging and thereby forbidden as price fraud if the amount is a sixth greater than the actual purchase. The purchaser can demand reimbursements for the overcharge for the amount of time it would take to assess the value of the item with a merchant or his relative. Others ruled that overcharging was by a third, which the merchants were pretty happy about, but he also ruled that the purchasers had all day to retract the sale, which then upset them, so they followed the former opinion. The Gemara says, it's a debate if this impermissible overcharge of a sixth is a sixth of the actual value of the item or a sixth of what the man is paying for the item. This is argued from a few sources. It's additionally debated. It also clarifies the different opinions of time frames and essentially holds that if the overcharge is under a sixth, the sale is valid with no refunds. And if it's exactly a sixth, it's a valid sale, but the seller must return the excess charge as long as it's within the proper time frame, which is a point that also applies if it's greater than a sixth, which we said was time to assess the value from a merchant or relative. It brings sources. Additionally, regarding this limited time frame of retracting a sale, some say it applies to a buyer, however the seller can retract whenever he wants to. It brings a few particular cases of sellers overcharging, there being a refund requested, and the resulting situation based on the particular time frames. New Mishnah. Both the buyer and seller are subject to not commit price fraud, as it does for ordinary people and merchants. Others say that there's just no price fraud for merchants. If somebody committed price fraud, overcharging, essentially the buyer, the other man, has the upper hand, meaning he can demand his money back or the excess overcharged amount. The Gemara cites scriptural quotes for this concept. The opinion which holds merchants are allowed to commit price fraud, meaning under or overcharging, is as they should be allowed to undercharge if they want while selling an item to get money and make a more pressing sale, for instance. It clarifies sources for the remaining points of the Mishnah and debates if it's permitted to stipulate within a sale that they're going to ignore the guidelines of price fraud and charge far beyond or beneath its set value. These principles are discussed further. New Mishnah. Coins erode over time, and as they did, they would decrease in value. It's considered to be fraud if a coin is given and it's been reduced past a 24th its value. Others say if it's been reduced past a 12th its value, others say a 6th. The receiver can demand repayment within a time frame in cities, within the time it would take to show it to a money changer, and in villages until the next Shabbos. If the giver of the coin recognizes it, he can take it back no matter how much time has passed. It can be used to deconsecrate Ma'is or Sheni type coins, as it's really only super particular people who would refuse to accept such a coin. The Gemara quotes a different source, which essentially says the same but reversed, that anything less than the set amount of coin erosion just can't be used. According to the opinions that say you can use coins which have eroded in values less than a sixth, this would be different than typical sale items, which we had just said can't be sold outside of a range of a sixth, as people would be more particular about coins which won't circulate if they're undervalued. It also gives the measurements for how much a coin can erode before it must be disposed of, out of concern it could be used to cheat somebody, which are individually qualified. Some say such an eroded coin should be used as a pendant with a hole in the middle so it won't be found and misused. or otherwise just destroyed completely. The time frame of returning an eroded coin was split between cities and villages. By overcharging other items, non-coins, as discussed earlier, some say the time frame applies specifically within large cities, others say it just applies everywhere, as everyone everywhere can tell the value of something like a coat, but only within cities are there professional money changers who can accurately assess the value of an eroded coin. As was stated in the Mishnah, the coin can be returned whenever if the giver wants, although it's not necessary. It also qualifies the principles of deconsecrating tithe coins, which are then discussed further. There are further points on laws of tithe discussed, of ma'aser sheni, and reimbursement of an additional fifth after redeeming consecrated things. These principles are clarified further. It additionally mentions a principle from Tractate Bava Metzia that if a thief stole an item and denied doing so, taking a false oath, and then admits that he had, he pays an additional fifth. It explains how this principle also applies by teruma and ma'aser tithes, and consecrated property, along with a few various sources. If something has a derivative of consecration sanctity, some say the additional fifth value that's paid when redeeming does not apply, and it brings sources for this point. New Mishnah. It was said that price fraud was created by a charge outside the range of a sixth. It's also said that regarding people taking oaths in court that they don't owe part of a debt, the minimum of this is for silver mois. This requirement for taking an oath is only if he admits to part of the debt, the minimum of admission of which would be for a pruta coin. It also mentions a bunch of laws that have the minimum value of involvement to be a pruta coin. There's this case we just said, where the minimum admission to obligate somebody to take an oath is that of a case involving a pruta coin. A woman can be betrothed through a pruta minimum. There's liability for benefiting from consecrated property called me'ila, from property worth a minimum of a pruta. Somebody who finds lost property worth a pruta must try to return it, and somebody steals a minimum of a pruta and then takes a false oath denying this. When he eventually returns it, he must travel to wherever the man is to return it. The Gemara says it repeated the point about price fraud as an introduction to these new points. Based on the fact that it's excluded from the list, it's actually a debate if the laws of price fraud apply if the sum is counted in prutas. Now, our list had those specific mentioned 5 times that the legal minimum value of a situation is that of a pruta coin. Others had a slightly different list, the first being the unmentioned price fraud, the second being to take an oath, the third for betrothal, the fourth for theft, and the fifth is that a session of court is held for claims worth a pruta. Our source didn't teach this last one, as it was dealing with laws of theft, teaching how far somebody needs to travel to return an item, as mentioned, and also returning the lost item, teaching that there's an obligation to return it even if it drops in value under a pruta. This second opinion has his list to teach laws of theft, and it also mentioned the last point in court to show this opinion, as others do disagree with the point. It further qualifies the choices of instances given in these lists. New Mishnah. There are 5 instances where somebody is obligated to pay a principal and also an additional fifth. A Kohen who accidentally eats teruma tithes of various particular listed sorts, somebody who redeems his 4th year fruits or ma'aser sheni tithes needs to add an excess fifth, somebody who redeems his own consecrated item, somebody who uses a minimum pruta value of consecrated items, and if somebody steals a pruta minimum from somebody and then swears falsely that he hadn't, he would need to pay the principal and an excess fifth. The Gemara additionally qualifies all these individual cases. It argues further points on whether the particular concerns of separating tithes from bakers apply, for instance, in certain unique scenarios. New Mishnah. Some things are not subject to laws of price fraud. Slaves, notes of indebtedness, land, and temple property. Penalties of double, times 4, or times 5 payments would not apply by these. An unpaid guardian of property does not need to take oaths that he wasn't negligent if the property he was watching got damaged, and a paid guardian would be liable if he was negligent and otherwise would not need to pay. If somebody is responsible for consecrated property, he would be subject to the laws of price fraud. Some say the sale of a Torah scroll, an animal, or a jewel are not subject to price fraud. Others disagree. The Gemara cites scriptural sources for these points. These are discussed. It's asked as to whether or not renting movable objects is subject to price fraud, as to whether sales and rentals are comparable. Some seem to say a rental is viewed as a sort of a temporary sale. It's also asked if somebody planted wheat seeds and then right after sold them. There's a debate if there's applicability of price fraud. Some say yes, as the seeds are viewed as if they're in a container. Some say no, as they're considered to be land, which is not subject to price fraud. There's a debate this at length, and additionally, what it's considered to be by various other laws of various types of tithes or offerings in regards to just planted seeds, which go unresolved. These further principles are additionally qualified. It also discusses particular unique laws that applied within the temple treasury regarding these laws. Scriptural sources are brought for the various points from the Mishnah. The principles of individual responsibilities of types of guardians are additionally described. There was also that latter opinion which said that there's no price fraud for Torah scrolls, which is explained to be as it doesn't have a value limit, and jewels or animals, some say there's no price fraud as people would purchase them outside their actual price range to match set of a sort of what they already had, as they're considered to be important. Based on this, there would also be other exceptions to the application of price fraud by a horse, a sword, or shield during a war, which wouldn't have price fraud as they're necessary for military reasons to protect people's lives. New Mishnah. The same way you shouldn't be dishonest with buying and selling, you should not be dishonest with your words. For instance, you shouldn't ask the price of an item if you don't plan to buy it. If somebody had repented, you shouldn't go and remind them of their past misdeeds. If somebody was descended from converts, you shouldn't remind them of that either. The Gemara brings sources for these points from Scripture and gives various instances of things you shouldn't say, whether because they're dishonest or as they'll offend the person you're speaking to. Very, very broadly, you should be very careful with your words to never say things that are dishonest or things that will embarrass people. In fact, some say verbally harming somebody is even worse than monetarily wronging a person, as verbal words harm the person himself as opposed to his finances, and also restitution is not possible. It speaks on how improper it is to embarrass others. Some say there's an exceptionally long punishment in Gehenna for those who commit adultery, somebody who publicly embarrasses their friend, and somebody who calls their friend an embarrassing nickname. It gives further instances as to how improper it is to embarrass one's fellow, and quotes many verses and teachings describing this. It also says one should be very careful to not upset their wife. Related, it said that since the destruction of the temple, the gates of prayer were closed, but the gates of tears were left open to us. It's also said it's better to not listen to one's wife by religious matters, but one should listen to one's wife by worldly matters, according to one opinion. It quotes many similar teachings on these points. There's a famous story quoted regarding the topic as to not offending people. Essentially, there was a debate between the sages and Rabbi Eliezer as to whether a certain type of oven, which in this case was cut up and refused together with sand, whether it was subject to the laws of impurity or not. Rabbi Eliezer said that it was considered to be pure. The sages vehemently disagreed, and they argued with him at length. Rabbi Eliezer argued his point and eventually declared that if he was right, the nearby carob tree should prove it. The carob tree then uprooted itself and moved away a long distance. The sages responded by saying, "You can't bring a proof from a carob tree." So Rabbi Eliezer said, if he's right, the water in the nearby canal should prove it. The water then flowed backwards. The sages again responded, "You can't bring proofs from a canal." So Rabbi Eliezer said, if he's right, the walls of the study hall should prove it. So the walls started to collapse until the sage Rabbi Yeshua rebuked the walls, asking why they're getting involved. So out of respect for both of them, they just stayed slightly leaning. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer said, if he's right, heaven should prove it. So a voice declared from heaven that the law accords with Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Yeshua responded saying, the Torah is not in heaven, meaning it was given from heaven to people who then have to apply the laws to the best of their understanding. So essentially he said heaven spoke as a test of a sort, and it says that much later a different sage spoke to the prophet Elijah, who said that God was pleased with this statement. Anyways, as Rabbi Eliezer refused to concede the point to the sages, they eventually excommunicated him. So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer's student, was sent to inform him of this, saying it had to be him, as if Rabbi Eliezer was informed improperly, the world could be destroyed. So Rabbi Akiva wore black and sat at a distance from Rabbi Eliezer and implied the excommunication through his words. So Rabbi Eliezer tore his garments and sat on the floor and cried, and a third of the olives, wheat, and barley in the world spoiled. Rabbi Eliezer was so upset then that anything he looked at got incinerated, and the sage Rabbi Gamliel, the Nasi who had excommunicated him, his boat nearly sunk. Rabbi Eliezer was actually married to Rabbi Gamliel's sister, and eventually Rabbi Eliezer prayed the Tachanun prayer, much to her chagrin, and Rabbi Gamliel passed away. It also quotes verses explaining the wrongdoing of being unkind to a convert. New Mishnah. Further forbidden deceptive practices in sales. Produce from different fields cannot be mixed even if both are new. Obviously, new produce can't be mixed with old produce. Strong wine is allowed to be mixed with mild wine, as it only improves it. Sellers cannot mix sediment into wine, but they can put in the sediment, which is going to be explained soon. If somebody mixed water with wine, it can't be sold unless the customers are informed that it's diluted. It can't be sold to a merchant in case he decides to use it to cheat his own customers. If the regional custom is to dilute wine, it can be sold. It's permissible to combine grain from different threshing floors into one silo. Wine from different presses can be put in one cask as long as they're not intended to mix. The Gemara explains why old and new grain can't be mixed. It's also ruled that strong and mild wine can be mixed, at least during the wine production season when people are aware that this is done. The point on mixing sediment is explained. Old sediments cannot be mixed with new wine, or new sediment with old wine, but wine can be mixed with its own sediment. The remaining points are qualified. New Mishnah. It's a debate if it's permissible to give roast grain or nuts, treats essentially, to children to encourage them to shop at your store. It's a debate if you're permitted to lower your prices below the market price. It's a debate if it's permitted to sift crushed beans to remove refuse to make it look better, essentially, in the shop. Some say no, others say you can, but they would say that you just can't sort only the top layer, leaving the bottom layer unsifted. A seller is not allowed to beautify and dress up something he's selling, be it a slave, an animal, or a utensil. The Gemara explains, some allow giving treats to kids shopping at your store, as technically everybody could just do that. It additionally explains how dressing up items isn't allowed, giving instances, no standing up animals' hairs to make them look more healthy. It gives some instances of things that are permitted, adding fringes to coats, adjusting garments in certain manners, painting baskets, etc., things involving new merchandise. It gives an instance of how it's forbidden to beautify slaves, once somebody dyed his slave's hair to make him look younger and it washed out and it was said to be improper. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Bava Metzia discusses the various laws of interest. The first Mishnah discusses these points. Very broadly, charging interest is forbidden. There are two types of interest brought, neshach and tarbis. Neshach is defined as lending 4 coins to be repaid with 5 coins, or 2 sa'ah of wheat to be repaid with 3, which is forbidden. The other type was tarbis, which is described as somebody buying wheat, say for 25 coins at market price, but before he received the wheat, the price raised to 30 coins. Then the seller tries to claim this wheat as a debt worth 30 coins to be redeemed by goods which he doesn't have in stock, such as wine, for instance, whose price is subject to change. So this too is forbidden. The Gemara tries to suggest that as the example of tarbis brought in the Mishnah is one within rabbinic law, that neshach and tarbis are the same within biblical law, it argues if this is the case from a few sources. Also, these two general categories of interest apply with any type of item besides for those mentioned. These principles are discussed further. It's also said Scripture lists prohibitions against charging interest, robbery, and fraud, and they're all listed separately. This is because interest alone can't be specified as it uniquely is prohibited towards the borrower, robbery alone can't be specified as it's done by force, and fraud alone can't be specified as the victim is completely unaware of the crime being committed. It additionally explains why each can't be learned from any combination of two of them. Verses also specifically prohibit stealing, to include prohibitions against stealing to annoy somebody or stealing to repay double later. Verses also specify against using false weights to teach that it's even prohibited to bury weights in salt, which was done to change the weight, and the offense occurs even from the time of burying them in salt, even if they haven't been used yet. Further verses are expounded on. Related, it's taught that the verses describing the prohibitions against interest, the laws of tzitzis, the laws of proper weights, and also the prohibitions against eating non-kosher insects are all mentioned in connection with the exodus from Egypt, to show that the same way God was able to differentiate so particularly between the firstborns, he's also able to differentiate between the specific particularities of all those laws. The specific types of interest are qualified, and also it's a debate if the prohibited prearranged interest is allowed to be recovered through the court, depending on the type of interest. It argues this from a few sources. It quotes additional locations debating as to whether types of interest could be recoverable. Some rule that any interest that would be enforced by a non-Jewish court, if it was paid, it's returned back, and if it wouldn't be enforced, it would not be returned, such as advanced interest or subsequent interest, which is giving a gift to a lender before or after lending to encourage loans. Now, the forbidden tarbis interest was described as somebody buying wheat and the price going up, and the seller trying to keep the wheat as a debt to be redeemed for wine, which he doesn't yet own. This is not permissible, as the seller isn't receiving actual money for the wheat, he's only entering a debt, so there's not considered to be a preset market price to be redeemed on other goods. It brings sources for this, and there are other opinions on this explanation. These points are discussed, and there are also various opinions as to whether it's permitted to substitute money or goods for other contracted goods, which is a debate from a few opinions, and it's dependent on whether the contract allowed for such a substitution. This is additionally discussed. There are other points that said if somebody gives money for produce at an early price, he has to inspect the produce at the threshing floor so as to make the sale binding, to the point where if the seller retracts, then the court would censor him. In fact, by this, going to the seller's property isn't strictly necessary, he just needs to meet with him in person. Some related laws prohibiting interest, it said any form of reward for waiting for payment is forbidden. It said if somebody buys an item at the market, here the example is wax, which go for 4 per coin, and the merchant says if he pays now, he'll give him it later at 5 per coin. It's allowed if he has the wax on hand, and otherwise it's not permissible. This would apply even if the seller has made orders of supplies here for wax which are pending. He still can't preemptively make the purchase until he actually has them in stock. Additionally, it said if somebody borrows small change and finds he was given more coins than agreed, if it's small enough that it was probably a mistake, it should be returned, but if it's more, it's considered to be a gift. It discusses this in some additional particular cases. New Mishnah. Somebody who loans to another man cannot then live in a residence within the man's courtyard or rent from him for less than the typical price, as it's considered to be interest. The Gemara says normally if somebody lives in a man's courtyard without him knowing, rent is not necessary to pay because the courtyard owner didn't lose anything. However, if he made a loan to him and then lived there, this constitutes interest, as just described, and would be forbidden. This shows all of this applies even in a place where a courtyard isn't typically rented in. There is variation on this point. It gives some instances of particular cases of borrowers and benefit. There are particularities discussed. If somebody demanded interest from another person, and the man paid in wheat, which the market value at that point was 4 per coin, but he gave 5 per coin, it's a debate if he's reimbursed at 5 or 4 per coin. Similarly, if somebody demanded 4 zuzim of interest, and the man gives his coat instead, the court can't retract the coat, they only retract 4 zuzim. Others disagree and say they retract the actual coat, as otherwise people will see it and think poorly of the man. Further, if somebody was told to pay interest and he did so by renting out his property to the man is still repaid with the coins from the stipulated interest. New Mishnah, somebody who rents property can increase the rent due to a delayed payment, but that somebody selling an item can't increase the price due to a delayed payment. It gives instances of these. The Gemara additionally describes these principles. It also defines some laws that it's impermissible to sell items to be repaid at a later date when you know the prices will have gone up. It's ruled that prearranged interest is recoverable in court, and it's ruled that regarding forward contracts, the seller can choose to either deliver the goods or their value. New Mishnah. If somebody sold a field to a person and the buyer paid part of it, it's forbidden for the seller to tell the buyer he can give the total sum later and then take retroactive possession of the field. If somebody lent something and used his field as collateral, conditional that the lender will acquire the field in 3 years if the loan is not paid, this is permissible and was something that was done. The Gemara discusses particular cases on these laws. These are qualified for their bringing specific individual instances, and there are additional points on laws of binding agreements. Further principles of interest are discussed. Points on pledged property are brought, which is essentially land used as collateral. For instance, if somebody gives a lender his land as collateral, if the lender harvests produce from this land sufficiently, it could be considered payment for the debt, and if he ate more than what he's owed, he doesn't need to repay it, and it wouldn't extend to repaying other loans. If the property belonged to orphans, then if the lender consumed excess produce more than what he's owed, it said he needs to repay it. Others debate these points, and it further discusses these principles. It also discusses the viability of pledged collateral fields made on condition of a reduction and whether the produce can be eaten from. There are further points, and it makes some rulings. It repeats that it's impermissible to sell items to be repaid at a later date when you know the prices will have gone up. It said to be impermissible for 2 partners to have one of them fully pay capital in a business venture and then write in a document to add the other partner's estimated share of profit. This is forbidden, as it's not certain that there will be a profit. Finally, it's ruled that it's impermissible to specify when using land as collateral that it should be leased back for a set amount of produce, as if this is done, people will question how the lender acquired the land to be able to lease it back to the borrower. New Mishnah. Some other laws of business partnerships. It's forbidden to give a storekeeper a product for him to sell and keep half the profit. Similarly, somebody can't give a person money to buy and sell produce and then keep half the profit unless he pays him wages like a worker. You can't commission somebody to set up an egg farm to keep half the profit, nor can you have somebody raise assessed calves or young horses to keep half the profit unless he's being paid a wage and the cost for the animal food. However, this can be done with unassessed animals. In such a case, the herdsman would be responsible to raise the animal until it reaches a third of its growth, or if it was a donkey, until it can carry a burden. The Gemara defines payment of the storekeeper as a worker, specifically as that of an idle worker, which is the salary a person would take to leave his job and become a storekeeper. It explains why all these examples were given and qualifies additional cases. Regarding payment of wages, it said that something extremely small, like sharing a dried fig or shed whey and wool, are considered to be a legally valid wage, among others. It brings other particular instances of business partnerships. There are additional points on this. New Mishnah. It's permitted to assess the value of a cow or donkey or anything that works and eats from its work, and then give it to a herdsman to keep half the profits without needing to pay a wage. If the custom is to divide its offspring immediately, that would be done. If the custom is to raise the offspring, that must be done. Some say a calf or colt and its mother can be assessed together and given to a herdsman to raise to keep half the profits and no wage. Additionally, a landowner can increase the rent of his field towards somebody when rent is owed without concern of it constituting interest. The Gemara discusses this and also some regulations of ship rentals. Simply, it's ruled that regarding ship rentals, the owner can collect for both rent and damages, and rent is collected at the time the boat is acquired, and damages are collected at the time of something on the boat breaking. Some say that money belonging to young orphans can be loaned on interest as a special ruling to be able to help them. Others disagree and they debate this from various sources. Generally, the court assigns a person to take care of orphans' property. It describes what kind of person, generally an honest one with stable properties who holds by Torah law and otherwise. New Mishnah. It's forbidden for a Jewish man to accept Son Barzel assets, which is where one partner supplies capital and the other manages the business. This is as the dividend is considered to be interest, so it can be borrowed to or from a non-Jewish man or from a resident alien. A Jewish man can get permission from a non-Jewish man to lend his money to a Jewish man, but not through the consent of a Jewish man. The Gemara additionally clarifies these principles. It also clarifies, while there are prohibitions against paying or accepting interest to a Jewish man, no such prohibition applies to a non-Jewish person, which is based on some scriptural verses. It brings several teachings, generally on how wrong it is to lend on interest and the severe consequences for doing so from a number of verses. It brings related discussion on these laws. It's also said, according to some, non-Jewish men can be agents for anything besides for teruma tithes. Others say they can't be agents for Jewish people, but Jewish people can be agents for non-Jewish people, but this is not an accepted view. Additionally, it's said that non-Jewish people also have the power of acquisition through a third party. It also discusses some laws of interest in regards to a convert and some additional points on promissory notes, and this goes further. New Mishnah, it's not allowed to enter a contract to pay in advance for produce unless it has a set price. The contract can be made without this if the seller actually has the produce. A contract can be made on wine if the seller has grapes, or on oil if the seller has olives, or on pots if the seller has clay, or on lime if the seller has limestone. Some say a contract can always be made on the future sale of manure. Others say only if the seller has some in a compost heap. It's a debate. If the seller wants to protect himself in case the price drops, he can stipulate the sale to be at the best possible price. Some say even if this wasn't stipulated, he can either demand reimbursement or undo the sale. The Gemara says the issue with entering a forward contract to buy produce in the future based on the current price is that of it occurring in small towns where the set prices just aren't established. There are other opinions as to whether such contracts are permissible. It discusses other unique types of loans along with bringing a few particular cases. There's a debate if it's permissible to give an advance payment for the yield of a vineyard. Some say no, as it resembles a type of interest. Others disagree, as it's possible the vineyard could be reduced through damage, so there's no possibility of it being like interest. Although both would agree it's allowed if the grapes are harvested with oxen, where there's a high likelihood of loss to the grapes. It said if seeds are being lent to a sharecropper, the lender should till the actual ground to acquire it, so it's not considered to be a loan or interest. It gives other instances of principles in farming with another person to avoid anything that resembles interest. A number of other particular instances are discussed. There are related laws that said if 3 people give one man money to be an agent and buy something for them, and then this agent buys something for one of them specifically, then the item would be owned by all 3 men jointly. However, if each person's money was given, wrapped, and sealed separately, then the item would only go to the one that he bought it for. It said that marking a barrel with an identifying mark thereby creates an acquisition. It's only to the point that if the other party retracts the sale, the court censors them, unless the local custom is that this actually literally acquires the item, in which case it would work as such. The specific examples given in the Mishnah are individually qualified, which are then discussed further. New Mishnah, a person can lend his sharecropper wheat to be repaid after the harvest with the same amount of wheat, but only if it's for planting, not for eating. The sage Rabban Gamliel would do this, and if the price of wheat changed, going up or down, he'd always take repayment from the cheaper price as a personal stringency. The Gemara says, a source seems to say that this deal is only allowed before the sharecropper has started working the field. The difference is that this source is where the landowner would typically supply the seeds, and uniquely the sharecropper gave it instead. So any additions to this agreement after the sharecropper started working is considered to be like a reward of a forbidden loan, as mentioned. This is discussed. New Mishnah, it's forbidden for a person to be lent an amount of wheat on condition that he repays it after the threshing season. It's a debate if such a loan is allowed until he gains access to a storage shed of wheat that he owns. Similarly, some say a woman can't lend a loaf of bread to her friend to be repaid with another loaf later unless she assesses the value at the time of the loan. Out of concern, the price of wheat will go up, and then she'll effectively have charged interest. The Gemara says if somebody has an amount of produce, 1 se'ah, which was an old form of measurement, he can rely on this to viably borrow another se'ah, and if he has 2 se'ah, he can reliably borrow 2. Some say that if a man has 1 se'ah of a produce, he can then borrow as much of that produce that he wants. It's a debate who we hold like. If a loan is allowed if he just doesn't have access to the storage shed of his produce, the remaining points are discussed. It's said, according to some, that it's permitted to charge interest towards one's own relatives in order to teach them how wrong charging interest is as an educational thing, but it rejects this, saying then it could get people into the habit of charging interest, which is not allowed. New Mishnah. It's permitted for a person to have somebody weed for him on condition that he'll weed his yard in return later, but you can't have somebody weed for you and then repay him by digging, or vice versa. All the days of the dry season are considered to be the same, and all the days of the rainy season are considered to be the same. So a person can't have somebody plow for him during the dry season and repay him by plowing in the rainy season. There's a concept called advanced interest, wherein a person gives a man a gift so that he should lend him money, and there's a concept called subsequent interest, where a person gives a man a gift after being lent money. There's prohibitions of paying interest even with words, such as by trading valuable information. There's a biblical violation against charging interest for a lender, a borrower, a guarantor, and a witness for a loan. Some say even a scribe. This is based on a few listed verses. The Gemara gives a few examples of interest with words. It also qualifies exactly which of the listed types of people, the lender, the borrower, etc., which prohibitions they exactly violate if they do charge interest. It mentions how wrong it is to press somebody for payment, and it brings some verses showing the importance of having witnesses witness alone. It brings a related incident on this. It ends by bringing a teaching that there are three types of people who cry out but aren't answered. One who lends money without witnesses, one who acquires a master over himself, which is said to either mean somebody who writes over his property to a non-Jewish person or to his children while he's alive, and according to some, a person who refuses to move towns in spite of his lack of financial success. And lastly, one whose wife rules over him. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Bava Metzia discusses the various laws of hiring and renting workers or animals. The first Mishnah says, if somebody hired craftsmen and they deceive each other, which will be explained, they cannot claim monetary reimbursement. If somebody hired a donkey or a wagon driver to deliver wood or to remove soaking flax or to do anything which, if not done, will result in a financial loss, and the worker then reneged on their agreement to work, the man could then hire new workers as replacement, and the original workers must pay their wages. Or he can trick the original workers into doing the labor, which, as mentioned, will be explained. If somebody hired craftsmen and midway through their task they decided to quit, their wages are calculated in the least favorable manner. If the employer reneged on them and fires them midway through the job, he must pay wages in the most expensive manner. Broadly, any worker who deviates or reneges from his assignment receives a lesser payment. The Gemara explains, regarding the case where the two craftsmen deceived each other, it brings a few possibilities as to what this means. It could either be where one worker was told to hire other workers, and people in the region would be hired for either 4 zuzim per day, which is a type of coin, or 3 per day, and this worker hired other workers for the lesser price. Alternatively, it could be that the workers are also field owners and are being paid the lesser rate than what a field owner would be typically paid. Alternatively, it's that they were doing work such as digging a ditch and it became filled with water, so that way they can't just check how well they did, and then the workers claim that they worked too well for what they were paid. Alternatively, it's that a worker was told to hire other workers for 4 zuzim coins a day, and he hired workers at 3 per day, withholding information and payment from them. It actually debates further in this last case if it's viable, as they are technically agreeing to the payment. There are related points. It said, if an employer or an employee reneged on their agreement before daybreak, there's no need for reimbursement, as no one's traveled to the workplace yet. If the workers show up to the location and find no supplies, for instance, no grain to deliver, the employer must pay them wages, but reduced, as they didn't actually do any work. If the workers had actually started working and are hired by the job, and only ended up doing part, their wages are reduced. It's argued as to how exactly the wages are calculated, and there are further points. Related, it said if somebody hired workers to irrigate their field, but rain came beforehand, the workers are not paid. However, if the river overflowed and irrigated the field, which could have been predicted, he needs to pay the workers for the wages of an idle worker. It's also said if somebody hired workers to irrigate his field and the river source stopped up midway through the day, if this was uncommon, it's the worker's loss. If this was typical, if the workers lived nearby, it's their loss. If not, the employer needs to pay them. Another ruling is that if somebody hired workers for something and they worked fast and completed it by midday, the employee can choose to give them a less strenuous task to fill out their time. He can give them a task of equal difficulty and commend them to do it, and if the new task is more difficult than the original, they can't be made to do it, and they'd have the rest of the day off with full wages. Although in other locales where there was actual benefit to sitting idle, they would only be paid the rest of the day as idle workers. There are further points, and it explains how to calculate payment for incomplete labor if the worker quits midway through the task. It said, we hold that if craftsmen withdraw the service midway through their work, they would receive the lesser payment for the work. This apparently would not apply if the worker was hired by the day, however others still debate this. There are further points. Some hold if a person loaned 100 zuz coins to somebody and he was repaid 1 zuz at a time, this is valid. However, he does have grounds for complaint, saying that as he was paid over this long period, he ended up losing money. It argues this opinion from a few related discussions. Also, it was said, if a worker didn't complete his work within a set time, the employer could either have them pay the wages for new employers, which would be up to the amount of their own wages, and if he's able, the employer can even sell their leftover tools to hire new workers at a better price, or he can deceive them, which was explained at the beginning of this piece of Gemara. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a donkey to lead it up a mountain and instead leads it through a valley, or vice versa, even if they're the same length of a distance, if the donkey dies, the renter is liable. Specifically, if somebody rents a donkey to lead up a mountain and instead led it through the valley, if the animal slipped and died, the renter is not liable. If the animal died of heat exhaustion, he would be liable. And if he rented the animal to lead down a valley and instead took it up a mountain, if it slipped and died, he's liable, and if it died of heat exhaustion, he's exempt unless this was during the ascent, in which case he would be liable. If somebody rents a donkey and it becomes blind or is temporarily confiscated by the king, the renter cannot get reimbursement, but if the animal died or broke a limb, the owner needs to give the renter a new donkey. The Gemara explains the first part of the Mishnah, specifying that if the animal was led up a mountain instead of the valley or vice versa, the owner is responsible, is to show that if the animal didn't die from slipping or overheating, we can say the renter is still at fault, as it could have been the cold winter air that killed the animal, or that it died of exhaustion, or that a snake bit it, or simply it's like the opinion that as he deviated from the owner's intent, he's like a robber, and therefore is responsible for everything that happens. It finds sources for this latter ruling and how it applied to our case. In regards to if the animal becomes blind, some actually define this as the animal's legs withering from a parasite infection. It gives an instance of this definition being used to refer to moths eating garments. We said if the king confiscated the animal, the owner can just tell the renter it's too bad. This is if the confiscation is temporary. If it's permanent, some say the owner must give the renter a new donkey. Others disagree and say the owner gives a new donkey if it had been taken in the opposite direction that the renter is traveling. It debates between these two opinions. It's also said renting a donkey to transport glass vessels is the same as renting a donkey to ride on, which means a replacement must be provided if it gets hurt at all. Related cases are discussed. It said if somebody rents a donkey for riding and it died midway through the journey, even if it's not likely that the renter will find a new donkey, the renter must still pay the owner for the distance he traveled. It further qualifies this opinion. It's also said if somebody rents a boat to transport his goods and it sinks midway through the journey, some say if he paid the rental fee already, he doesn't get reimbursement, but if he hasn't yet paid it, he doesn't need to. This is where the boat and the cargo were specified prior. If they weren't, the owner and renter split the payment. Another case, if somebody rents a boat to transport his goods and then loads extra cargo midway through the journey, the renter can only give payment for the first half in spite of the change of additions or excess used rope. It is also said if somebody rents a donkey to ride, he has the rights to place his clothes, his flask, and his provisions on it, but the owner can stop him from putting anything else on it. The donkey driver can also place barley, straw, and his own provisions on the animal. This is where there are inns and provisions available on the road, as donkey drivers will go out of their way to find an inn, but not to get provisions. It's also said if a person rents a donkey specifically for a man to ride on, a woman cannot ride on it, as they didn't typically ride as well and could harm the donkey. If a donkey is rented for a woman, a man could also ride on it, along with any woman, even a pregnant and nursing woman. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a cow to plow on a mountain and then uses it in a valley, there's no liability if the coulter, which is the plowing piece, breaks. If it was rented for use in a valley and it was then used on a mountain and the coulter breaks, he needs to pay for it. If somebody rents a cow to thresh beans and then used it to thresh grain, there's no liability if it gets injured. If somebody rents a cow to thresh grain and then used it to thresh beans, which are more slippery, the renter would be liable for any injury. The Gemara says if the renter actually used the cow properly and it then gets damaged by the workers, it's ruled that the holder of the coulter pays, but if it was used on rocky terrain, the holder of the goad, which is this part here, also pays. It's also said if somebody sells a cow to somebody and gives the warning that it's a dangerous animal and that it will gore, bite, kick, and lie down on things, and then it turns out that it only had one of these attributes, the purchase is void. If the seller had said it had its blemish and then vaguely that it also had other blemishes, then the sale would stand, and it brings support for this. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a donkey to carry wheat and then uses it to carry barley, he's liable for any injury. If somebody rented a donkey to carry grain and then used it to carry straw, he's liable for any injury. By both, this is because the second item is more bulky, so are more difficult to carry. If somebody rented a donkey to bring a specific set amount, here a lesech, which was an old form of measurement, of wheat, and then brings a lesech of barley, the renter is not liable. However, he would be if he exceeded the set load amount. Some say this excess amount to become liable is a se'ah by a camel, and 3 kav by a donkey. The Gemara says there's a debate if the bulkiness of straw or barley is problematic as a load or as it's difficult to carry. It debates between these opinions. Some related excess loads, a kav measurement is too much more to be carried by a porter, either as he immediately collapsed or that he can charge extra for this if he wants, or it's that he didn't realize it was the excess weight that was wearing him down. Also, a lesach is too much excess for a small boat, a kar is too much excess for an average boat, and 3 kar is too much excess for a large ship. Related, it said that the typical average-sized boat must have the carrying capacity of 30 kar, which is relevant regarding buying or selling. New Mishnah. There are basically 4 types of guardians, which will be discussed a bit more in later chapters: unpaid guardians, paid guardians, renters, and borrowers. Now, specifically, unpaid guardians are only liable for damage to the watched item due to their negligence, and paid guardians are liable for damages not due to their negligence. A craftsman is considered to be a paid guardian, and once he completes his work and is waiting for payment, he's considered to be an unpaid guardian. Somebody who offers to watch somebody's property on condition they watch his property is considered to be a paid guardian. Somebody who asks a person to watch their property and they respond saying to set it down in front of me, they're considered to be an unpaid guardian. Somebody who lends money and is given collateral, he's considered to be a paid guardian towards the collateral. Others say if he lent money, he's an unpaid guardian. If he lent produce, he's a paid guardian. Some say if a person lent to a poor man and received collateral, he can then rent the collateral to others to slowly reduce the man's debt, since it's as if he's returning lost property. The Gemara says, it's a debate if a renter is considered to be like a paid or unpaid guardian. So a craftsman is similar to a renter, so it argues how this opinion could say it's like an unpaid guardian. So you could say the craftsman is different, as he's holding onto the item to demand payment, essentially. So he's considered to be a paid guardian, or it's just that it reverses the opinions. It qualifies the remaining points. It said that a borrower has a lesser degree of responsibility once his loan term ends. However, it said he would still afterwards be responsible as a paid guardian, which is a slightly lesser status. Sources are brought. Additionally, it's explained that the status of the paid guardianship when 2 people agree to watch each other's items is where it's not at the same time. Related instances are brought along with a few particular cases. Additional specific cases are brought regarding the case where somebody asks a person to watch the property and they respond saying to set it down in front of me. They're considered to be an unpaid guardian. Some say if the man said to set it down in front of you, he's not considered either type of guardian, and if he just said to put it down, it debates it and it's unresolved. It discusses opinions on the additional statements of the Mishnah. Regarding the last statement, it says we hold like the opinion that renting out a poor man's collateral to reduce his debt is permitted, but specifically only with an item with a high rental fee and a low wear amount to the item, something like a hoe or an adze, which is this, or similar. New Mishnah. If somebody moves a keg between places and accidentally breaks it, whether he's a paid or an unpaid guardian, he needs to take an oath that he was not negligent so as to not need to pay for it. Some take issue with this, which will be explained. The Gemara brings the source of this opinion and brings another dissenting one that only an unpaid guardian can do this, while a paid guardian actually does need to pay for it. Apparently, the first opinion holds that stumbling is not considered negligence. The opinion which says a paid guardian needs to pay says it goes by the different levels of responsibility, and the last opinion that takes issue with all of this is that even if the paid guardian was not negligent, he still needs to pay. And if the unpaid guardian stumbled on a flat surface, he can't really take an oath that he wasn't negligent, and even if it was a sloped surface, there need to be no witnesses. So some simply say that the oath here is rabbinically instituted, so that way people will be willing to move their friends' barrels around without having to be worried about needing to pay for the whole thing, as they could just swear that they didn't break it intentionally or with negligence. It additionally explains the remaining opinions and gives a few instances. For example, there's a case brought where a sage had his barrel of wine broken by some porters, so he took their cloaks as payment, but he was told, just for extra, as is required of the sages, to return the cloaks, and also he paid them their full fees so that way they would have food to eat. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Bava Metzia continues going through the various laws of hiring and paying employees. The first Mishnah says, if somebody hires day workers, he's only allowed to have them arrive early and work until dark, if that's the working custom of the locale. Otherwise, he can't do this. Additionally, if the custom of the locale is for the employers to feed their workers, he must do that too, to whatever extent the custom goes towards. In fact, broadly, everything goes according to its local custom by these laws. There's an incident recorded where the sons of one sage went and hired laborers and told them they'd provide them with food, and the sage told the sons to clarify that they'd only be provided with some basic accommodations, as these hired workers were the descendants of the forefathers, who were noted for giving their guests particularly lavish feasts, so he didn't want to make himself responsible for all of that. Others disagreed and said simply it goes by the current locale as for what you're expected to feed your employees. The Gemara clarifies, an employer can't have his workers work for longer than the local custom, even if he paid them a higher wage. Some specifically held that a worker needs to only work late but is not expected to show up early, which is explained to refer to by a new town with immigrants with no established custom, or it's that the employer is told his workers they are being hired according to the scriptural conditions of employment. A few related verses are expounded on. There's a story. A sage was speaking to some officers who were struggling to catch local thieves, and he gave them advice to enter diners in the morning and see who's really tired, and then ask them what their profession is. And if they say something like a student or a particular job that requires them to work at night, then they're probably innocent, and if they say otherwise, they should be questioned as a thief. So, they thought this was such a good idea that they decided to hire the sage to start implementing this. Other sages criticized him, saying it wasn't his place to go around arresting other Jewish people, and such a decision should instead be left to God. But the sage said that what he was doing was good, as he was ridding the Jewish people of their evildoers. Once, a man insulted the sage, and he had the man arrested, and then later tried to have him freed, but he couldn't, and the man was executed by the government. But he later found out that the man was actually guilty of the sin of cohabiting along with his son with a betrothed young woman on Yom Kippur, but in spite of this, he still felt guilty. So he ended up having a surgery performed to see if he had done the wrong thing, where he had pieces of his stomach fat removed and placed in the sun, and it turns out that they didn't rot. Apparently, this also happened by some other individuals. It also describes some interesting related points and some of the attributes of some sages, including their impressive physical qualities, which are listed, particularly the noted attractiveness of the sage Rabbi Yochanan, which is compared to that of a silver goblet filled with pomegranate seeds. Uniquely, however, he didn't have a beard, which is mentioned. This is seen in the famous story wherein Rabbi Yochanan, when he was younger, was swimming in the Jordan River, when suddenly a man named Reish Lakish, who was a famous bandit leader, saw him and tried to attack him as he thought Rabbi Yochanan was a woman. Anyways, after he realized Rabbi Yochanan was actually a man, they conversed, and Rabbi Yochanan recommended that instead he use his strength for Torah, and offered, if Reish Lakish were to repent from being a bandit chief, he could marry his sister, who was even more beautiful than him. Reish Lakish agreed, and they started learning together, and eventually Reish Lakish became a noted great sage who's frequently quoted throughout the Gemara. Anyways, many years later, they were debating the point as to when certain metal weapons start becoming susceptible to ritual impurity, and they began to argue. Rabbi Yochanan asked Reish Lakish about this, saying he used to be an expert on such weapons, and this upset Reish Lakish, thinking it was an insult, and he expressed this. But Rabbi Yochanan misunderstood him and thought he was expressing regret at changing his profession from being a thief. So Rabbi Yochanan became upset, and in turn, Reish Lakish became sick. Reish Lakish eventually passed away, and Rabbi Yochanan, in turn, was very upset. The other sages tried to give him a replacement student, but Rabbi Yochanan wouldn't have it, saying nobody compared to Reish Lakish, and he eventually became so sad that he lost his sanity, and the other sages prayed for him, and he passed away. Anyways, back to the original story with the sage who was appointed as an officer. He was still upset with himself, so he accepted physical suffering upon himself, and he became horribly ill, until eventually his wife told him to stop, and she had him healed. Anyways, then he went back to his studies, and he was extremely proficient in determining whether select blood samples were pure or not in regards to the laws of Nida. It brings other instances showing the greatness of the sage. Particularly, his body afterwards lay in an attic for many years, and it never decayed in his merit. It brings instances of similar things occurring to other sages and their referenced greatness. It also mentions the sage who had a son who really didn't want to become a sage himself, but eventually decided to and was very successful, as was his descendants. There are related teachings on this. It also mentions the greatness of other sages, particularly Rabbi Chia, about who it says would hand grow flax, weave nets, then trap deer, and feed the meat to orphans, and then prepare the deer hide into scrolls on which he wrote the Torah, and then went to villages and taught it to children, and also how to teach it to others to prevent the Torah from ever being forgotten. There are further points on his greatness. It said after he passed, another sage looked at Rabbi Chia's heavenly throne and was blinded until he requested forgiveness. It's also said that Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, told one of the sages that he would awaken each of the forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, at different times, as if they all prayed simultaneously and Mashiach would come instantly. And also, he mentioned that Rabbi Chia and his sons were comparable to them. So this sage quickly went to have Rabbi Chia and his sons all pray together. And then as the part of prayer for wind was said, wind started blowing, and by the prayer for rain, it started to rain, and by the prayer to awaken the dead, the world started to shake. So Eliyahu the prophet, in the meanwhile, was reprimanded and made to interrupt the prayer service by appearing in the form of a fiery bear. The greatness of other sages are referenced. There was Rabba bar Nachmani, who was forced to flee the country after people started lying that he didn't pay his taxes. He made it all the way to the city of Pumbedisa, and while he was there, the officers that were sent to find him were attacked by demons and had their faces turned backwards, so he gave advice on how to cure them and then left before he was arrested. Eventually he was arrested and imprisoned and prayed to God, so the prison wall collapsed and he escaped. So he went to live in a swamp and studied Torah all day, until eventually the angel of death came to fetch him, but couldn't approach him as he was learning Torah, so the angel blew into a reed, and the sage thought it was the officers coming to arrest him, and he prayed to quickly pass away instead of being arrested, which he then did. It said that a note fell from God in the city, letting the sages know where his body was, so that way he could be buried, and he was then eulogized at length, which is described. Back to the original point, we said that employers need to feed their workers according to the local custom. This is said to mean that the workers can demand to be fed first before working, if that's what's done in the region. It's also said that the forefathers would give great feasts to their guests, which it then proceeds to describe at length based on some verses, particularly involving the time Abraham had 3 angels come over as guests, as described in the verses, although the angels only pretended to eat the food, it says. It's actually stated that God made the day extremely hot, so that way Abraham would stay indoors and not need to deal with guests, as he had just been freshly circumcised, but he insisted and in fact went and chased after the 3 men after they almost left, saying that he was preoccupied. These 3 men were actually 3 angels, as is stated, particularly the angel Nachael, sent to give the news to Sarah that she was to have a child, and also to save Lot from the city of Sodom. The angel Raphael was sent to heal Abraham, and the angel Gabriel was sent to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It further describes this meal and the surrounding events. It mentions that the verse states Sarah was in the tent, specifically in a different room, showing she was very modest, which was stated by the angel to draw attention to it. It also says that Sarah regains her youth when she was told she would have children again. It's also said that after Yitzchak was born, everybody doubted that he was their actual child due to their advanced age, but this was disproven as they had a large party to celebrate, and Sarah was seen to be able to nurse, and the child looked just like Abraham, so it was clear they were his parents. It's also said that until this time, there were no physical signs of old age, until God decided it was necessary for people to be able to differentiate between Abraham and Yitzchak, who were identical. It's also said that there was no sickness before death until Yaakov, who prayed for that to be the case, so that way he could know when he was going to pass. And also, before Elisha, no one ever recovered from an illness until Elisha prayed that it should be so. It qualifies the remaining points. New Mishnah. The following types of employees are biblically permitted to eat from their employer's food. Somebody whose job it is to harvest produce, and somebody who works with detached produce that grew from the ground before tithing becomes necessary. The following do not have the right to eat of the produce that they're working with. Somebody who works with produce that is still in the process of growing, somebody who works with detached produce after tithing is necessary, and somebody who works with produce that doesn't grow from the ground. The Gemara cites the scriptural sources for all of these points. There are related adjacent discussions. It said that produce only becomes subject to tithing once it enters the owner's house, specifically through the main entrance, which is qualified. It discusses this and some related principles of tithing produce and brings additional sources for the listed points in the Mishnah. This is discussed further. It also asks as to whether the worker is allowed to put the produce in a fire to cook it before eating it. It tries, but is unsuccessful in comparing it to a few different cases. There's an apparent argument as to whether the worker can put salt on the produce as he eats it. It's explained to be prohibited if this is done with 2 fruit, which establishes an obligation for tithing. There are related points on the prohibition against muzzling one's animal as it works and how this would uniquely apply to the laws of tithes. There are other discussed points. For instance, it's said that an animal shouldn't even be muzzled and then brought to thresh. There's a debate if there's liability for not physically muzzling an animal, but just for verbally reprimanding it whenever it tries to eat. It debates between these opinions. It said that the punishment for impermissibly muzzling somebody's animal while threshing is both lashes and a monetary payment to the owner. This is according to the opinion, apparently, that there could be punishment of lashes and payment at the same time, although there are a few suggested answers and a few unrelated points are then discussed. These are basically some prohibitions against mixing diverse species of animals in breeding. New Mishnah. The worker gets to eat of the produce he works with, as described, even if he's only working with his hands, feet, or shoulders. Others say he can only eat the produce if he works with his hands and feet specifically. The Gemara cites sources for this debate. Related, it said that workers in a wine press can only eat grapes until they've walked the full length and breadth of the wine press, after which point they can then also drink of the wine. New Mishnah. If a worker was working with figs, he can't eat any grapes, and if he was working with grapes, he can't eat any figs. A worker is allowed to not eat anything until he gets to a place with better fruits and then eat over there. the worker can only eat of this produce during the time of his actual work. However, to prevent the workers from retaining excess to eat as they walk, they're allowed to eat from vines as they walk between vineyards and on the way back from the winepress. And similarly, a donkey can eat as it unloads. The Gemara gets into a debate as to whether a worker working on a grapevine can then eat of a different grapevine belonging to the same owner. It argued this from a few discussions. It's largely left unresolved. The last point on the donkey was to say that a donkey can eat from the load that's on their own back, so long as the owner doesn't actually take it and feed it to them. New Mishnah. A worker can eat very expensive fruits he's working with, even something like a cucumber or a date worth a dinner, which is a very large sum. Some say they can't eat more than their wage, but others say they can, and they just shouldn't be gluttonous personally and thereby not get hired. The Gemara explains, there's actually a difference between opinions as to whether the worker is advised to do this. Others say there's a difference, that there's disagreement if, for instance, the employer hired the man to pick a single grape cluster if he can then eat it, which is discussed further. Others say it's a debate if these principles apply solely to workers or to everybody. It's also a debate if the worker's produce actually belong to him specifically or not, which is relevant if he wants to have the produce sent to his family. It argues this from a few sources. This is additionally debated at length from various different discussions, and it basically ends by saying it's just a debate between different opinions. New Mishnah, a person can stipulate for himself, his adult son or daughter, his adult slave, or for his wife, that they waive the rights to their produce in exchange for monetary reimbursement. This is as they have intelligence and the ability to make decisions, unlike minor children or slaves or animals. If somebody hires workers to harvest his neta revai produce, which is fruit produced in its fourth year that can only be eaten in Jerusalem unless this tithe is taken from it, the workers cannot eat of it. If he didn't tell them it was this specific neta revai produce before hiring them, he must redeem some produce and then give it to them. Similarly, if he hired workers to repair his fig cakes or wine casks, they can't eat of them because they need to be tithed. But if he didn't tell them in advance that they're not tithed, he needed to tithe them and then give some to the workers. Also, those who guard produce can partake of the fruits, although that's not a scripturally based principle. The Gemara says there's a debate by this last point as to if guardians of produce can partake of them, if this only applies in gardens and orchards, or according to others, only to wine presses and piles of unprocessed produce. It debates these points from various quoted sources and finds proofs for this latter opinion. New Mishnah. There are basically four types of guardians: an unpaid guardian, a borrower, a paid guardian, and a renter. If something happened to an animal that needed to be washed, the unpaid guardian needs to take oaths regarding everything, exempting himself from negligence and payment. The borrower needs to pay for everything. A paid guardian and a renter take oaths if the animal broke a limb, was captured, or died of natural causes, and they need to pay for it if it was lost or stolen. The Gemara quotes the source for this. There are a few relevant instances discussed on these laws, and it more particularly qualifies each of these specific positions' responsibilities. New Mishnah. Regarding responsibilities of a guardian, an attack by a wolf is not considered to be unavoidable, while an attack by two wolves is, in regards to whether or not he's then responsible to pay for it. Others say one wolf is still unavoidable if there's a plague of wolves. Two dogs is not considered to be unavoidable, although others say they are if they come from different directions. An attack by a bandit, a lion, a bear, a snake, and similar are considered to be unavoidable, unless the shepherd decided to go and lead the animals to their lair. Death by natural causes is considered unavoidable. If the guardian caused the death, it's not considered to be unavoidable. If it fell off of a mountain, that's unavoidable unless the guardian brought it there himself. The Gemara discusses these and qualifies a few of them. For instance, the bandit here is specifically when he's armed, and it says he'd even be able to beat an armed shepherd, as the bandit would be willing to risk his life, unlike the shepherd apparently. If the shepherd approaches a bandit and informs him of the information around his camp and the number of people and everything involving that, it's not considered to be unavoidable. New Mishnah. An unpaid guardian can stipulate to be exempt from an oath, a borrower can stipulate to be exempt from paying, and a paid guardian or renter can stipulate to be exempt from an oath or paying. Generally, if somebody makes a stipulation contrary to Torah law, it's void. Any stipulation where the man does the action before making the stipulation is void. If the stipulation is possible to fulfill and made initially, then it stands. The Gemara explains how listed stipulations work, and this is like the opinion that they're allowed if they involve monetary law. It debates this and actually suggests that the reason is as the guardians didn't even initially obligate themselves to have more responsibilities than was stipulated in these cases. It also quotes a source which seems to say a person can stipulate to increase his responsibility. We said that if a stipulation can't be fulfilled, it's void. Others nevertheless debate this, although it does rule like the former. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Bava Metzia begins discussion on the 4 different types of men who have responsibility for an item, the 4 types of guardians, essentially, the unpaid guardian, the paid guardian, the borrower, and the renter. The first Mishnah begins. Generally, a borrower is responsible and liable to repay for pretty much any loss or damage to the borrowed object. However, if the owner of the item was working for the borrower at the time the item was damaged, the borrower is not responsible. Specifically, if somebody borrowed a cow and also had the owner of the cow working for him at the same time, and then the cow died, the borrower is exempt. As the verse states, if the owner is with him, he shall not pay. However, if he borrowed the cow and only afterwards hired the owner and then the cow is damaged, he is liable. As the verse says, if the owner is not with him, he shall surely pay. The Gemara explains in the first case, it's possible for the borrower to borrow the cow and hire the owner simultaneously, either if the cow is currently in his courtyard, so he can do both with an oral statement, or it's that he specifically stated that he's only hiring the owner at the moment that he acquires the cow. Additional sources are brought for these points and related rulings that were stated in the previous chapter. There are further sources brought for all the 4 different types of guardians and for the different degrees of responsibility. For instance, the first source for liability by an item being stolen or lost by a borrower are brought, and additionally the source for the exemption if the owner is also employed. In such a case where the owner is employed, it's actually a debate if there is still an exemption of liability if the item got damaged due to the borrower's negligence, which is argued from a few sources. Also, there's an opinion that for there to be an exemption, the owner must be actually working with his actual animal, and that the owner has to be in the borrower's employ when the actual accident occurs, and both of these are disproven. It additionally debates these principles. Some other discussed laws: if somebody borrows an animal specifically in order to sodomize it, is he considered to be a typical borrower as he's benefiting from the animal, or is he like a paid guardian and not liable for an unavoidable accident, as it's not really typical to use it in that manner? Additionally, it's asked, what if somebody borrowed an animal not to use, but just to have around to make himself look wealthy? What's his status of responsibility, as he's not actually using the animal? Another question, what if somebody borrowed an animal to use it for a task worth less than the minimum value of a pruta? Is that considered to be sufficiently legally significant? Additionally, what if somebody borrowed 2 cows to perform 1 task worth of pruta? Is the borrower fully responsible as each individual cow isn't doing a full pruta's worth of a task? A few other questions: if somebody borrowed a cow that was owned by 2 partners and one of the partner owners was hired to also work during this period, is this sufficient to create an exemption for damages as the other worker is in there? Also, if 2 partners borrow a cow and the cow owner was hired by one of the partners, is this sufficient to create an exemption? Thirdly, if somebody borrowed a cow from the property of a woman and then the husband is hired, or if a woman borrowed a cow and the owner was hired by her husband, is this sufficient to create an exemption for damage as discussed? Another question, if somebody tells an agent to be borrowed for me along with my cow to go and work for the borrower, is it sufficient for the agent to go and work in place of the owner to create an exemption? This is all based on a related argument by laws of tithes as to if ownership of produce is considered to be ownership of actual property. Anyways, basically none of these questions are answered here. There are related points along with an additional point. If regarding a woman's personal property, if her husband is considered to be a borrower or a renter, it brings some cases where this creates a relevant distinction. It's also asked, if an animal becomes weakened over the course of its work, is the borrower responsible for this? And it essentially answers no, as even if the animal died during the course of the work, the borrower can say he borrowed it to have it work, not to sit in an enclosure, so he's not responsible. Related to this, it mentions, if a person borrowed a tool from somebody, if it breaks, he should bring witnesses to say that he only used it in a typical working manner and thereby be exempted from any liability. And if there are no witnesses, the borrower must return the pieces of the tool and make up the remainder with payment. Some related points on this principle of exemption: if an animal dies due to a work-related death, somebody borrowed a cat and the mice gathered together and killed the cat, and it was ruled to be a work-related death. In fact, generally, as there's an exemption for liability if the owner of the item is in the borrower's employ prior to the actual borrowing, technically the borrower can just really quickly ask the owner to get him a drink of water before borrowing the item, thereby technically hiring the man, at least legally, and exempting himself from liability with the item. Individuals whose profession puts them in the public employ, such as a school teacher, a butcher, a bloodletter, a town barber, or similar, they're always considered to be in everybody's employ, so if anybody borrows from them, they're considered to be hired, and the borrower is exempt from damages. It debates other particular cases. New Mishnah: if somebody borrows a cow for the first half of a day and rents it for the second half, or borrows a cow for today and rents it for tomorrow, or he borrows 1 cow and rents another identical cow and the cow died, and the owner is claiming that the animal died during the borrowing period, or it's the borrowed cow, and the borrower says he just doesn't know, the borrower is responsible and liable to repay. If the borrower/renter claims that it died as a rental, and the owner says he doesn't know, the borrower/renter is not liable. If the owner said the cow died during the borrowing period, and the borrower says no, it died during the rental period, the borrower needs to take an oath that it occurred as he said, and is then exempt. If the owner and the borrower both say they have no idea when it died, they just divide the contested amount. The Gemara cites opinions which seemingly disagree with the first ruling, and it attempts to disprove them from here. This is discussed further. In the mentioned situation where the owner claims the animal died during the borrowing period and the borrower claimed the animal died during the rental period, the borrower needs to take an oath that it occurred as such. This is as he first needs to swear that the cow died naturally, and then by extension needs to swear that it died as a rental. Additionally, if they both said that they didn't know how it died, they divide the cost, as mentioned, in accordance with the opinion that says entirely doubtful property is just divided without an oath. Now, if somebody borrowed a cow and also hired the owner, as mentioned, exempting himself, and then rented it afterwards, after the owner left, it's a debate if the rental and the borrowing are considered separate, or if the rental is considered to be an extension of the borrowing, thereby retaining his exemption, essentially. It additionally asks about the inverse, what if the man rented it and then borrowed it afterwards? Is this considered to be an extension? And further, what if he borrowed it and then rented it and then re-borrowed it again? What's the law? Does the rental in the middle act as an interposition? And further, what if he rented the cow, borrowed it, and then rented it again? So all of these remain unresolved. New Mishnah, if somebody borrowed a cow and the lender sent it along with his son, or with his slave, or with his agent, or with the son, slave, or agent of the borrower, and the cow died, the borrower is exempt. If, however, the borrower had requested of the owner to send the cow with his son, with his slave, or with his agent, or with your son, slaves, or agent, or the owner volunteered to send any of these individuals and the borrower consented, and then the cow died in transit before the borrower received it, he's liable to repay for the cow. Additionally, if the cow is being returned after use with any of these individuals and it dies in transit, the borrower is still held responsible. The Gemara clarifies it's speaking specifically about a Hebrew slave who isn't fully acquired by his owner, and therefore the borrower is responsible if the animal dies in transit and not the owner of the slave. Some say it could also refer to a Canaanite slave. It's just that it's considered as if the borrower had the man drive it towards him, meaning the borrower is at this point responsible. It debates this latter opinion from a few discussions, so essentially it's been established that a borrower becomes subject to liability when he or his agent takes possession of the borrowed item. Now, if somebody borrows an axe, it said he only acquires it once he uses it to chop wood. This is explained to mean that the owner can no longer renege on his lending agreement at this point. Others still disagree with this principle. It brings related laws on misappropriating temple property. It's also said if a man broke a jug of wine in a market which typically sold for 4 coins, but on market day it sold for 5 coins, before market day they need to return a new jug of wine, and afterwards they need to return the full 5 coins. This only applies if the shopkeeper had no wine to sell. Additionally, the value of the labor and the opening of the wine jug are deducted, as the owner no longer needs to take care of those things. New Mishnah, if somebody exchanges a cow for a donkey with somebody, and then the cow then gives birth, or if somebody sells their Canaanite slave woman who then gives birth and the seller claims she gave birth before the sale and the buyer claims she gave birth after the sale, the value of the calf is divided. If somebody had 2 slaves, say a large one and a small one, or 2 fields, a large one and a small one, and the buyer claims he purchased the larger slave or field, and the seller says he's just not sure which one he sold, the buyer would get the large one. If the seller says he sold the smaller one and the buyer says he's not sure which one he bought, he gets the smaller one. If the seller claims he sold the smaller one and the buyer claims that he bought the larger one, the seller takes an oath that he sold the smaller one, and he then gives that one to the buyer. If they both say they don't know which one was purchased, they divide the disputed value. The Gemara says in the first case, where they're debating when the calf was born, they can't just check where the calf is currently, as it's where the calf is currently in a field belonging to neither of them. This is qualified, and apparently it disputes the opinion which says that if both parties are claiming property that neither possess, it's divided, which apparently would apply if both parties are claiming their side with certainty, although others nevertheless dispute this notion. Now, we said if there was a large and a small slave, and the buyer and seller are both claiming the other one was purchased, the seller needs to take an oath. There are a few issues with this, such as why the borrower isn't the one taking the oath, the fact that taking oaths on slaves isn't really allowed, and others. So it's explained that they're not actually debating over a slave, they're arguing over money to purchase a slave, either a large or a small one, or possibly clothes for a slave, a large one or a small one, etc. It additionally debates between these opinions, along with points as to when such oaths would be permissible. New Mishnah. If somebody sells as olive trees for their wood, and before the buyer cuts them down, the trees then produce olives, if they're so inferior that they produce less than a quarter lug per se'ah, which is a few particular old measurements, the original tree owner can just keep them. If they produce this amount or more, if the buyer claims them as a part of the tree, and the seller tries to claim them as a part of his land, they should just be split. if a river carried off somebody's olive tree and deposited it in somebody else's field, and one claims the olives as a part of his field, and the other claims them as a part of his tree, they should just be split. The Gemara qualifies the circumstances of the first case to be that the seller hadn't specified when he wanted the tree removed, and it's saying that less than a quarter log per sa'ah, people aren't particular about, so the owner can just keep it. More than this, people would care, so it needs to be split as mentioned. Additionally, this quarter lug per sa'ah amount is accounted after the cost of harvesting and pressing the olives. Additionally, in the latter case, where a river uproots somebody's tree to somebody else's field, they divide the olives. This is explained to be where the tree is uprooted along with the earth, and only during the first 3 years after it was deposited in the other field, as afterwards he can claim he could have just planted his own tree to benefit his field. Related, if the original owner said he's taking his tree back, he's not permitted to do this, specifically as there's a necessity to plant trees and cultivate within the land of Israel. There are related laws on tithing property. Additionally, it said if somebody broke into somebody else's field and then without permission planted a bunch of trees there, it said if the field isn't ready for trees, they evaluate the cost and he receives a lesser value. If it is ready for trees, they evaluate how much a person would be willing to have somebody plant those trees, and he's then repaid that amount. It brings sources for these principles, which were based on a few particular cases. It brings some additional cases. If somebody rebuilt another man's ruins without consent and then wants to take back his wood and stones, it's a debate if he's allowed to do this. It's ruled he is allowed to take his materials back. But if somebody planted trees and then wanted to take his trees back, specifically within Israel, he's not allowed to do so due to the obligation of cultivating the land of Israel. New Mishnah. If somebody rents his house to another person, he's not allowed to evict him in the winter, which is from the holiday of Sukkot until the holiday of Passover, without notice being given during the summer, which is at least 30 days before the holiday of Sukkot. In large cities, there must always be a 12-month notice before evicting a tenant. Within stores in small towns and in large cities, there must be a 12-month eviction notice. Some say with bakers and dye shops, which had much longer credit terms towards customers, as will be mentioned later, they had to be given a 3-year eviction notice. The Gemara says eviction in the winter is prohibited without the notice in the month prior, specifically if the time of rental wasn't specified. Additionally, if even 1 day of the 30 days prior notice before winter extend into the actual winter, the eviction wouldn't be permissible during that winter. The landlord is, however, allowed to increase the rent only if the rental of houses generally became more expensive in the area. If somebody's house collapsed, he's allowed to immediately evict his tenant. Also, if the landlord tries to sell or give the property to a third man, the tenant can prevent this. If the landlord's son just got married and needs a place to stay, he needs to notify his tenant properly before evicting him, and if he doesn't, he can't just evict the tenant. It brings other particular cases. New Mishnah. If somebody's renting a house to a person, the landlord is obligated to provide the tenant with the door, the bolt, and the lock. And also, he needs to construct or repair any necessary living items within the house. If it's something the tenant can make himself, he should. Manure found in the courtyard of a rented house belongs to the owner for use as fertilizer, and the tenants can only keep the oven and stove refuse. The Gemara explains further, a landlord is obligated to build doors, open windows, and strengthen the ceiling or supporting beams, while the tenant needs to build ladders, roof railings, plaster the roof, and otherwise. The tenant is responsible to set up the mezuzah. Removing the mezuzah is prohibited unless the tenant was renting from a non-Jewish person. It qualifies which party gets to retain manure or oven refuse based on where it's located. It also qualifies some points on chasing away a mother bird before taking eggs. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a house to somebody for a year and then the year became a leap year, adding a month, the tenant gets the extra month. If the house was rented by the month and it became a leap year, the extra month goes to the landlord. There was a case where somebody rented a bathhouse at 12 gold dinars for a year and 1 gold dinar for a month, and it became a leap year and was ruled to divide the rent for the extra month. The Gemara additionally qualifies these principles as to how they fit with the wording of the Mishnah. If a tenant claims he paid his annual rent on the last day possible, and the landlord denies receiving it, similar to prior cases, the tenant can take an oath that he paid it, and it's sufficient. Also, if a man rents a house for a term of 10 years, and this was written on an undated document, evidently, so the tenant can't just claim ownership of the property after having lived there for a while. If the landlord testifies that the tenant has been there for, say, 5 years, we believe him. It's also said a person can borrow a utensil forever if he asks to use it in its good state, basically so long as it's in good condition. So long as this is done with a full acquisition of the lender committing to do so, and if it breaks, the handle must be returned. It brings some other particular cases. If somebody asks to borrow a hoe to dig this garden, he can only use it to dig that specific garden. If he asks for a hoe to dig a garden, he could dig any garden. There are other broad instances. New Mishnah. If somebody rents a house and it collapses, the landlord must give his tenant a new house. He can't make the new house too large or too small. It also can't now be 2 units, or if it was 2 units, it can't now be 1 unit. There can't be more or less windows unless they both agree to it. The Gemara says this is where the rental wasn't for a particular house, but it was for a house like a particular referenced one, which is why a similar replacement is necessary. This shows that if the stipulated house was on a riverbank, you can't just give him a new riverbank house. It also needs to have all of the same attributes as listed. And that's the end of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Bava Metzia covers the various laws of renting out fields and the tenant's rights and responsibilities. The first Mishnah says, if somebody is being leased a field, if the local custom is to cut the crops, he needs to cut the crops. And if the custom is to uproot them, he needs to uproot them. And if the custom is to plow the field afterwards, he needs to plow the field afterwards. Basically, he needs to go according to the local custom unless otherwise specified in the lease. The grain is divided, as would processed and whole straw, and wine from a vineyard is divided as would be the branches and canes, which were the stakes used to support the vines, which need to be supplied by both of them. The Gemara says, if the custom is to cut the crops, say to fertilize the earth with the leftovers, the renter is actually not allowed to uproot them if he doesn't want to cut them. And if the custom is to uproot the crops to clear the fields, he's not allowed to cut them to retain the straw for his animals. When it said that if the custom is to plow the field, the farmer needs to plow the field, this is to show that this applies even if the custom is not to weed the field, and the farmer did it anyways, he still also needs to plow the field. Included in the general notion that the renter needs to abide by the custom is that if typically the trees in the field are included in the lease, they're included, even if the rental fee has been reduced. And the inverse also applies. If the custom is to not include this, it would apply even if the rental fee was increased. Some other points: in Babylonia, it was customary for a sharecropper to not be given straw unless the landlord personally decides to. Additionally, anything essential for the security of the field is the landowner's responsibility, while anything additional is the sharecropper's responsibility. Furthermore, the hoe, shovel, pail, and similar are all the landowner's responsibility, while the sharecropper needs to take care of the irrigation ditches. It was said that both need to supply the canes, which it defines as stakes used to prop up the vines, as mentioned. New Mishnah: if somebody was leased a field that's irrigated or containing a tree, if the stream then dried up or the tree fell, there's no deduction in rent to compensate for the loss. However, if the field was leased specifically as it was irrigated or that it contained a tree, he would receive a deduction. The Gemara clarifies in the first case, it's a small river that dried up, and he's not getting a rent reduction, as the landowner can just say he should bring his own water with a pail. Also, it says these first 2 Mishnahs apply to both a tenant and a sharecropper, and all future Mishnahs make a distinction between the two. It also qualifies the fact that when he specifically mentions renting an irrigated field or one with a tree, he receives a reimbursement if it loses that attribute. New Mishnah: if somebody leased a field and then did nothing with it, it's assessed by how much it could have grown, and he needs to then repay that amount to the landowner, as is stipulated in the contract. The Gemara brings other instances of rulings based on specific wording used within a stipulated document. These relate to the loss of marriage contracts and are discussed further. A case is brought: a man was leased a field and said that if he left it fallow, he'd pay 1,000 zuz coins. He then left a third of it fallow. Some said he needed to pay 333.3 coins. Others said that it was a condition that was made with intent to not fulfill it, which is called an asmachta, which is not legally binding. It debates this latter opinion, and it mentions that it was clearly an exaggeration here. Another case, there was a man who leased a field to plant sesame and then planted wheat there, which ended up being as valuable as the sesame. It was said the landowner still doesn't take a reduced share of the crop. Other similar cases are discussed, and it digresses onto a few unrelated points, and these are discussed further. New Mishnah: if somebody was leasing a field, even if he doesn't want to and he's paying his rent in full, he needs to weed the field, as otherwise it'll cause issues when his lease expires. The Gemara explains the landowner can require the weeding, as the weeds could continue growing in the following season. New Mishnah: if somebody is leasing a field and it didn't produce a full crop, if enough grew to make a heap, he needs to care for the field. Others say it has to be enough for sowing. The Gemara explains he needs to care for the heap, as that's what's typically stipulated within a contract. There are a few opinions as to how much exactly this is. Some say enough that a winnowing shovel can stand if placed inside. Others say it's 3 sa'ah, others say 2. There are a few other opinions. It also mentions opinions on minimum amount of produce in regards to susceptibility for impurity. Measurements by other laws are brought, such as the maximum amount of weight a person can be carrying as he prays or on his head while wearing tefillin, ratios of leket, field charity, and similar. New Mishnah: if somebody is leasing a field and locusts or strong wind ruin his entire crop, if it's a general calamity, he can reduce payments from the rental, and if it's not a general calamity, he cannot. And as to what exactly a general or a non-general calamity are, they will be defined soon. Some say if you leased the field for money as opposed to produce, you can't reduce the rental price. The Gemara gives opinions as to what a general calamity is. Some say where most of the valley where his field was located was ruined by wind. Others say it's where the 4 fields on all sides of the field were also ruined. A few particular cases are asked, what if 1 row of produce was ruined by wind? What if 1 row was not ruined? What if the surrounding fields were struck by wind and his field was ruined by drought? And a few others, and they all go unresolved. If a landowner told his tenant to plant wheat, and the man planted barley instead, and then wind ruined the field, the tenant can't get a refund, as the landowner can say that it would have been fine as he had prayed for wheat. If all the fields of the landowner were ruined by wind, including the leased field, but most of the valley wasn't ruined, the tenant needs to still pay full rent, as clearly this divine punishment was directed towards the tenant, not towards the landowner. Now, if the tenant's personal fields were ruined by wind, as was most of the entire valley, and then the leased field was also ruined, the blame could also be laid at the tenant, and he'd need to pay full rent. It additionally debates the exact definition of a general calamity. Some say if the tenant just hadn't planted anything and then a calamity struck, locusts ruining the field for instance, he can't get a reduced rental, although it does debate this. There's a related case brought. Somebody had leased a field near a particular river, and the river became blocked off and it was ruled to be a general calamity, and the man got his rental payment reduced. New Mishnah. If somebody was leasing a field at a rate of 10 kors of wheat per year, and the crop went bad, he can pay his rent from that crop. If the crop was better than average, he also needs to pay rent from that crop specifically, and is not allowed to just buy lesser wheat to give in instead. The Gemara asks, if a similar case where a field was leased to plant one type of produce, and instead the man grew barley, which went bad, it was said that he couldn't pay rent with it as he planted the wrong produce. It discusses similar cases and debates some opinions on them. New Mishnah. If somebody was leasing a field to plant barley, he cannot plant wheat. If somebody was leasing a field for wheat, he can plant barley. If somebody leased a field for grain, he can't plant beans. If the field was leased for planting beans, he can plant grain. Others say no such variation is permitted. The Gemara argues what the source for this latter opinion is. It additionally discusses the various opinions on these laws. It also says a source that it's preferable to have a field near a town if protected by walls, but without this it's better to be further away to protect against the evil eye. It mentions some related points, but also digresses onto some medical advice on the importance of eating bread in the morning, which it sources, among other points as to what constitutes good planting ground. There are related points. It said everybody, even orphans, need to contribute towards the tax towards city gates, besides for the rabbis, as they don't need protection. Everybody, however, including rabbis, are obligated to contribute towards a community well. If the townspeople are actually digging the wells themselves, the rabbis weren't expected to do the manual labor, as it was deemed disrespectful. It mentions related points. It also said it's wrong to take property on the bank of a river, and as the Persian government had ruled that if somebody owns a field, they get land extending into the river, the new man that takes this property there can be evicted. It's also said if somebody decides to take property that exists right in between 2 properties belonging to 2 partners, it said that this is very morally wrong. And there's a debate if he can be forcibly removed. It discusses some related cases on the topic of purchasing adjoining properties. These are all spoken on further. For example, if a plot of land belongs to one man, and the house on it belongs to a different man, the owner of the land can prevent the house owner from selling the house to a different person, while the house owner cannot prevent the landowner from selling the land. There are other similar rulings. Another instance, if 2 fields are separated by palm trees or rocks, the neighbor who, as has been established, typically has first rights to the purchase of the field, as it's right next to him, would only have such rights here if he can extend 1 furrow into the neighboring field. Similarly, if there are 4 landowners surrounding 1 piece of land, whoever buys the centerpiece first gets priority and owns it. And if they all came at the same time, they divide it along the diagonals, like so. If somebody was leasing a field for only a few years, he cannot sow it with flax, which takes a long time longer for its soil to recover. He also has no rights to beams of wood growing from any sycamore trees in the field. If he leased it for 7 years, he has the rights to both of these. The Gemara says there's a debate in the first case if he at least has rights to the typical growth of the sycamore during the few years he's there. It argues this from a few sources and discusses a few related incidents. There's another broad case. Somebody had a professional gardener who died, and then his 5 son-in-laws wanted to take over the position. It was ruled he could refuse them, but he had to repay them for the work their father had done on the land. Another case, if a professional gardener told his employers that if he causes them a loss, he'll leave, and then ends up causing them a loss, it's a debate if he's paid for the improvements he had made to the field. It brings a related incident. Similarly, if a gardener was working on a field and then quit because he wanted to move to Israel, for instance, it's argued how much he's paid. Related points are discussed further. There are additional principles. It said if there's a contract for a loan that doesn't specify the number of years the collateral was kept for, and the lender says it was for 3 years, and the borrower says it was for 2 years, and then the lender consumed the collateral, it's discussed, but it was ruled that the collateral stays with the one who consumed it. Similarly, if a lender claims he has rights to collateral land for 5 years, and the borrower says he only has the rights for 3 years, and the borrower claims he lost the contract, it's a debate as to how long the field can be used for. Additionally, if a sharecropper claims he was to work for half the produce, and the landowner claims he sent the man to work for a third of the produce, it's also a debate. Some say we believe the landowner, others say it depends on the local custom. It discusses this further, and it debates some other cases. New Mishnah. If somebody was leasing a field for 1 septennial for 700 coins, the sabbatical year where work is not permitted is included in this count. If he leased it for 7 years for 700 coins, the sabbatical year is not included, and they would add a year afterwards. New topic. If somebody is hired for the day, he must be paid that night. If somebody was hired by night, he must be paid the next day. If somebody was hired for a few hours, he can collect all night and all day, which will be defined. If somebody was hired for a week, a month, a year, or a 7-year cycle, if he finishes by day, he is paid that day, and if he finishes by night, he's paid that night and the following day. The Gemara quotes scriptural sources for this law, which essentially establishes that delaying payment towards an employee is forbidden. This is qualified. For instance, timely payment is the responsibility of the employer, not an agent, which it gives some examples of. When it's said that somebody hired for a few hours collects payment all night and all day, some say that this means that if he was hired by day, he's paid during the rest of the day, and if he was hired by night, he's paid during the rest of the night, and others say it means that if he was hired by day, he's paid during the rest of the day, and if he was hired by night, he's paid during the rest of the night, and also the following day. It argues this from a few quoted sources. Additionally, this is discussing illegal retention of wages. There's some debate as to what exactly constitutes actual wage theft. Some say it's where the employer claims he already paid him. Others disagree and say that it's where he refuses to pay him. There are a few opinions. New Mishnah. Whether somebody's having a person, an animal, or a utensil in his employ, he's obligated to pay them on the same day. If the worker doesn't demand his wages, then there's no violation. And he's also allowed to direct the worker to a storekeeper or to a money changer, and if he's not paid, the employer has done no transgression. Additionally, it's instituted that a worker, when his payment is due, can take an oath and collect it, and if there are witnesses that he demanded it, he can also take an oath to collect it. Additionally, a resident alien, a non-Jewish man living according to the 7 Noahide laws, has the principle of needing to have his wages paid on time, although there's no prohibitions regarding a day worker as the verse states. The Gemara brings sources for these principles, quoting the various relevant verses. These are additionally discussed. It said if the employer directed the worker to the money changer and he's not paid, it's a debate if he can then return back to the employer to demand payment. It's also asked if contractual work has the prohibitions against delaying payment apply, which is based on if the craftsman here is acquiring the improvements he's made to the utensil in question, which determines whether the paid money is a loan or a wage. It said that there still can't be a delay in payment, and it argues this from a few relevant discussions. These principles are discussed further, and there are some additional points. New Mishnah. If somebody lends something to another, he can only take collateral in a court, and he cannot enter the man's house to take it. If the borrower temporarily needs his item of collateral, it should be given back temporarily depending on the time. For instance, a pillow should be returned by night, and a plow should be returned by day. If the borrower dies, some say the lender doesn't need to return the collateral items to the heirs. Others say the items, after the first 30 days, don't even need to be returned to the borrower. They can then be sold to the court to collect his debt. The Gemara gets into a debate if an agent of the court can enter a house to seize collateral. It argues from several sources. It's also said that a lender needs to leave the borrower at least its basic necessities when collecting payments, which is then additionally qualified. It discusses this further, some sources, how it's assessed, and similar. It quotes this from a story wherein a sage met the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi, in a cemetery, and were discussing these principles. Anyways, the sage asked what the prophet Elijah was doing in a cemetery anyways, as Elijah is a Kohen and Kohanim aren't allowed in the cemetery, so Elijah quoted a source that non-Jewish graves don't transmit impurity, as the verse states, "Now you, my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, you are Adam," Adam meaning man. So the Jewish people are referenced here specifically using the word Adam, unlike non-Jewish people who are typically referenced using a different word which means man, not specifically the word Adam. And the verse discussing the application of corpse impurity specifically mentions the word Adam. Now naturally this does not mean that non-Jewish people aren't considered to be people or men, obviously they and everybody else is. It's saying that the application of the laws of corpse impurity applies specifically to Jewish people, while there is no impurity contracted from a non-Jewish grave based on the particular choice of wording of the usage of the word Adam describing Jewish people, which is then also used in reference to the laws of grave impurity. Anyways, Elijah then asked the sage why he wasn't able to study properly, and the man answered, because he had no money. So Elijah led the sage to the Garden of Eden and told him to collect some leaves, but as he was leaving he heard a voice reprimanding him, so he returned the leaves. However, his cloak absorbed the leaves' smell, and he was able to sell it for 12,000 denarim, which he then gave to his sons-in-laws. It additionally qualifies principles of returning collateral if it's needed by the borrower. These are discussed. New Mishnah. A widow, whether she's poor or rich, does not have collateral taken from her, as the verse states. The Gemara discusses this and debates some related principles. New Mishnah. Somebody who takes a mill as collateral transgresses a negative commandment and is liable for taking 2 utensils. As the verse states, he shall not take a lower millstone or an upper millstone as a security. This liability applies toward taking anything used for food preparation. The Gemara gets into debate as to how many lashes were received for violating this prohibition. It argues sources for this debate from some related discussions. The specifics of this are then qualified. And that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10, the final chapter of Tractate Bava Metzia, continues discussing laws of property ownership, now more particularly in regards to houses. The first Mishnah says, if there was a 2-story building, and each floor belonged to a different person, and the whole structure collapsed, they divide the wood, stones, and earth. Specifically, they determine which stones from which story are more likely to have broken and give that to that person. And also, if either of them recognizes his own stones, he can take them as a part of his total. The Gemara qualifies, they're not able to just determine how the wall fell, as the stones are already cleared away by an unknown party, and the stones are currently in a courtyard belonging to both parties, or they're in a public domain, or it's just that they can both take the stones as they're not too particular here. When one man recognizes his stones, it's where specifically the other man recognizes that some of them do belong to the other man, and he's not sure about the others. So he can't take an oath, and he must give over the rest of the stones. The other man then gets his identified stones as a part of his total, which could be useful if they were larger or of a better quality. New Mishnah. If there was a 2-story house with the upper story being rented out and the upper story collapsed in, and the downstairs landlord doesn't want to fix it, the upper story tenant can live in the landlord's downstairs apartment until the upper story gets fixed by the landlord. Others hold that the bottom story landlord needs to fix the ceiling, while the upper story tenant needs to plaster over it. The Gemara says there's debate as to how much of the ceiling needs to collapse for this to be applicable. Some say majority, others say even only 4 cubits, which they explain. It additionally debates the terms of the rental agreement in this particular case. This is additionally discussed. According to the opinion that they both need to repair parts of the ceiling here is defined by the locale, being either a mesh of reeds or strips of wood, depending on the region. Similarly, there's a case where the plaster layer between 2 floors wore out and water dripped from the top floor onto the bottom story and ruined some items. So it was debated as to who was responsible to repair the plaster. There are other similar disputes quoted. New Mishnah. If a ground and upper story were owned by 2 different people and it collapsed, and the owner of the upper story told the owner of the lower story to rebuild his lower part so he could have his house put back on top, and the bottom story owner didn't want to, the upper story owner could just rebuild the lower story and then just live there until the other man pays him the expenses. Others disagree and say it's still the other man's property and he must pay him rent. Instead, the owner of the upper story needs to rebuild the lower story and the upper story with a roof over the top, and only then can he stay in the lower story until he's paid. The Gemara brings a quote. There are 3 cases where it's forbidden to benefit from another man's property without consent. One of them is this case, according to the opinion that the upper story man can't just live in the lower story's property. Additionally, there's the opinion that a dyer must return mistakenly dyed wool to the owner if the improvements to the wool is greater than the cost of the dyeing, and if the dyeing cost is more expensive, the owner needs to pay the dyer for the improvements. This was mentioned towards the end of Tractate Bava Kama. Thirdly, as will be mentioned towards the end of Tractate Bava Basra, if a borrower paid part of his debt and deposited his loan document with a third party, saying if he doesn't give the rest of the debt to the third party, the loan document should be returned to the lender. Some say the document should not be returned. It debates as to why this opinion holds this by these cases. In a case where the owner of a lower story wants to change the structure of the apartments, he's allowed to change them to unhewn stones, but not to hewn stones. He's allowed to change the walls to half-size bricks, but not to full-size bricks. He's allowed to change the ceiling to cedar wood, but not to sycamore. He's allowed to reduce the number of windows, but not increase them. He's allowed to reduce the height of his house, but not increase it. The exact inverse of all of these applies to the upper story. If the structure collapses and neither party wants to rebuild it, it's ruled that the lower story gets 2/3 of the land and the upper story gets 1/3. New Mishnah. If there is an olive press built into a hollow of a rock, like a cave of a sort, with a garden above it and it collapsed, the garden owner can sow seeds in the chamber below until the olive press owner makes a roof. If a privately owned wall or tree fell into a public domain and caused damage, the owner is not liable to pay for it. If the owner was given a set time to remove it, he's only liable for damaging something after the set time expires. If somebody's wall was next to a garden and it fell over and the garden owner demanded the stones be cleared away, the man is obligated to. If the garden owner accepted the wall stones as a gift, he no longer needs to return them if he doesn't want to. Similarly, if somebody hires a worker to gather straw and the worker demands his wage, and the employer says to take some straw as his wage, he doesn't need to accept it and he could just demand money. But if he accepted the straw, he no longer can be made to relinquish them. The Gemara says in the first case, some moments earlier, there was debate as to how much of the roof needs to collapse. Some said majority, others said 4 cubits, which is explained. The standard amount of time a person was given to clear his well retrieved from the public domain was 30 days. The remaining points are additionally qualified. New Mishnah, if somebody puts manure into a public domain, it can't just be left there. It needs to be immediately carried out. It's forbidden to soak clay in a public domain or to make bricks in a public domain. Kneading clay in a public domain is allowed, just not to make bricks. If somebody's building in a public domain, the stones should be taken and placed immediately and not kept around. If somebody nevertheless caused damage, some say he's liable to repay for this. Others say people were allowed to store their building supplies for up to 30 days before use. The Gemara quotes some opinions that seemingly debate these. Some hold that there's no liability for damage if the act was illegally permitted, although it's agreed if the act was permitted by the sages, there's no liability of payment, which it sources. It also defines payment responsibilities if there are several damagers. For instance, if a quarrier gives rocks to a stonecutter, which then damaged something, the stonecutter would be liable. And once they're given to a donkey driver, the donkey driver is then liable. And once they're given to a porter, the porter is then liable, etc. And if the stone fell off of its top row after being placed and it damaged somebody, then everybody is liable. But this is assuming they were all assigned as one team. If they were all hired separately, then it's only the last person, the stone placer, that's liable. New Mishnah, if there are 2 gardens on top of each other and there are vegetables growing on the vertical surface between them, it's a debate who they belong to. Others say it just goes to the lower garden if you can reach them, otherwise it goes to the top garden. The Gemara clarifies, the roots definitely belong to the upper garden. The debate is regarding the foliage, and it's a debate if it has the same status as the roots. There are similar debates elsewhere, and it explains why all of these are necessary. The last opinion said that the lower garden gets them if he can reach them, which is clarified to be only so long as he doesn't need a strain to reach them. If the owner of the upper garden can reach the vegetable's foliage but not the roots, or only the roots and not the foliage, it's left unresolved what the status is. It ends off by saying we follow this latter opinion, that it goes by if the lower garden owner can reach the produce. And that's the end of chapter 10 and the entire Tractate Bava Metzia. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from the tractate. There's a responsibility to return a found lost item. There are 2 main general principles on this topic. The first is that if the original owner of the lost item gave up hope on ever recovering the item, he has effectively given up ownership on it, and the item can be kept by whoever finds it. If there is a unique identifying mark on the item, called a simun, then the owner should have an easier time reclaiming it, and the finder should make every attempt to locate the owner to return it. Typically, a lost item belongs to whoever grabs it first. There's a general prohibition against charging interest of any sort towards other Jewish people, including anything that resembles charging interest. Employers and employees have responsibilities towards each other to do their work in full and be paid in full. Somebody who's responsible for an item needs to take care of it. There are basically 4 degrees of responsibility: an unpaid guardian, a borrower, a paid guardian, and a renter. Each has different levels of responsibility and would be liable to repay for the item within different circumstances. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.